My name's William, and I'm 31 now. I haven't spoken to my parents in almost a year, not since the reunion, not since the meltdown, not since the truth slipped out like a jagged little secret too sharp to keep hidden. But before all of that, before the shouting and the shaking and the way my mother wouldn't meet my eyes, I was just the independent one. You know, the label families like to use when they want to pretend they're proud of how little they do for you. The title they slap on the child they've already quietly written off. Growing up, it was always about Sarah, my sister. 2 years younger, golden brown curls like my mother's, a dimple that made old ladies stop in grocery stores and coo over her. She wasn't just the favorite, she was the plan. Everything revolved around making sure she had what she needed to thrive, which in our house translated to whatever Sarah wants, Sarah gets. And me? I was resourceful, apparently. At least that's what they called it when I asked why Sarah got a car for her 17th birthday while I biked to my part-time job in the ring. You're just so independent, Will. You always figure it out. They'd say it like a compliment, like handing me a scrap and clapping for how well I chewed. My dad was a quiet man, the kind who avoided eye contact at dinner but became animated when Sarah talked about her school projects. Mom was louder, always planning things, school fundraisers, church events, Sarah's birthday parties that somehow always had themes and rented tents. She used to work in HR before she scaled back to focus on family, which I eventually learned meant she worked part-time from home, mostly reviewing documents for a small company she called her consultancy. She called herself a mentor. To Sarah, when I turned 18, I was handed a firm handshake from Dad and a brochure for state college. "You'll do fine," he said. "We raised you to stand on your own." I didn't have the heart to tell him that's only true if someone teaches you how to walk in the first place. Meanwhile, Sarah got a different experience entirely. Full tuition to a private liberal arts college 3 states away. A monthly allowance. A leased BMW. She's going to be a psychologist, Mom beamed. She just has the kind of heart for people. I try not to take that as a jab, but when you've been the background character long enough, even the softest lines start to cut deep. I didn't resent Sarah at first. She was just playing the role they wrote for her. In high school, she was sweet to everyone, the kind of girl who got flowers on Valentine's Day from the whole soccer team. I remember once, junior year, she found me in the garage trying to fix my bike chain with greasy fingers and offered to help. We laughed. She was wearing a dress and still knelt down to hold the frame steady. For a moment, it felt like we were just brother and sister, no politics, no favoritism, just kids trying to help each other. I clung to that memory a long time. But college changed her. Or maybe the way our parents indulged her in college changed her. She came back from her first semester with a designer purse, an offhand laugh, and the kind of tone that made every sentence feel like a performance. Everything became a story with her at the center. If I mentioned something good happening in my life, she'd tilt her head and smile like she was indulging a child playing grown-up. After graduation, she didn't even apply to jobs. Mom offered her a position at the consultancy. She called it an apprenticeship. Said she was learning the ropes of real leadership. From what I could tell, Sarah mostly sent emails and joined Zoom calls with other part-time moms who all used words like synergy and empowerment while sipping wine out of mugs labeled boss lady. Me? I worked through college waiting tables, tutoring calculus, anything I could to get through without loans. I graduated with a degree in computer science and got a job at a mid-sized startup. I coded during the day and freelanced at night. I lived cheap. Saved, taught myself new frameworks, kept up with trends. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. No handouts, no leased BMW. But the thing about being independent is that it's lonely. I'd come home for Thanksgiving, sit at the table while Sarah held court, and watch as my mom served her a second helping without asking. Dad would nod along to everything she said, while I was lucky to get a housework before they started talking about Sarah's upcoming spa weekend or the networking retreat in Napa Mom was taking her on. I used to try. Really. I'd bring gifts. Offer to help around the house. I even made Sarah a custom-coded budgeting app once. Something slick and simple with a beautiful UI that tracked expenses and helped with savings goals. I gave it to her over Christmas dinner. She said, "Ah, that's cute," and never opened the file. That was the last gift I brought. Things came to a head last year. It started with the reunion. My mom's side of the family, big and dramatic, decided to hold a formal family reunion at a rented vineyard. Everyone was coming, second cousins, great-uncles, even my Aunt Linda who lives in Italy. Sarah, of course, was helping plan the whole thing with Mom. It's going to be elegant but relaxed, she said. Like a Nancy Meyers movie, but with better food. She said this to me while sitting cross-legged in a velvet armchair, sipping oat milk from a wine glass. I wasn't planning to go, but my cousin Eric called me out of the blue and said, "You should come. Really, it won't be the same without you." Eric and I were close as kids. He's one of the few who always treated me like I mattered, even when our family didn't. I hadn't seen him in years, so I said yes. The moment I walked into the venue, I knew I was out of place. Everyone was dressed like they were attending a wedding. String lights wrapped around trees. A live band played soft jazz. And at the center of it all, Sarah stood with a flute of champagne, laughing at something Mom whispered to her. She looked like she belonged there. I looked like I'd come to reset the Wi-Fi. But then Eric came over and hugged me like no time had passed, and for the first hour, it was actually nice. A few of my younger cousins were asking about the app I'd built that went viral earlier that year. I'd just sold a version of it to a mid-sized financial firm, and the licensing money was enough to make me seriously consider quitting my day job. I didn't bring it up, someone else did, and suddenly I was talking about machine learning and data privacy to a circle of people who genuinely seemed interested. That's when Sarah saw me. She walked over, plastered on a smile, and said, "William, it's been forever. Are you still doing that tech stuff?" I said I was. She tilted her head. "That's so great for you. I think it's so important to find work that keeps you busy." I felt my jaw tighten. "Yeah," I said. "It's been good. We just signed a deal with." But she was already looking past me, waving at someone else. I let it go. I always did. But then dinner started, and the real fun began. Mom gave a toast. She thanked everyone for coming, praised the organizers, complimented the caterers. And then she said, "Of course, none of this would have happened without Sarah. She's the reason we're all here tonight. She keeps this family connected." There was a small round of polite applause. My fork froze midair. Eric shot me a look across the table. I smiled, nodded, tried not to let it sting. But then Sarah stood up, clearly moved by the moment, and gave a speech of her own. It was long, flowery, full of inside jokes I wasn't part of. At one point she said, "Honestly, I wouldn't be half the woman I am today without my parents' support. They've always believed in me, funded my dreams, made me feel like I could do anything." That part was true. What wasn't true was the way she glanced at me when she said it, as if daring me to disagree, as if reminding me who got the support and who didn't. But I stayed quiet. Until dessert. That's when Eric leaned over and said something I'll never forget. His voice was low, careful. "You know, I always wondered if you ever found out." I looked at him. "About what?" He hesitated. "Never mind. It's not my place." That made my stomach twist. "Eric, what are you talking about?" He took a slow sip of his wine, then looked me dead in the eye. "The trust fund," he said. "The one your grandparents set up for both of you. You know, the one they said was split evenly." I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was already racing, fingers curling against the edge of the table. Because I did know about the trust fund. At least, I thought I did. But suddenly, everything I thought I knew, everything I had assumed about why I had to scrape and save while Sarah floated through life, started to unravel. And that's when Sarah's voice rang out across the table, loud and clear. "So, William, what do you do again?" she said, like she was challenging me to perform. And I smiled. I didn't answer Sarah right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch just a little too long. Long enough for her smile to twitch at the corners. Long enough for heads at the table to turn. Long enough to make her squirm, if only slightly. Then I leaned back in my chair and said calmly, "I run my own software company." It wasn't even a brag. It was just the truth. A few of my cousins, the ones who'd been asking about my app earlier, perked up. Someone murmured, "Wait, you own it now?" Sarah blinked, then let out a laugh that sounded just a touch forced. "Wow, that's impressive. Good for you," she said, in that sing-song tone reserved for toddlers who managed to tie their shoes. Then she turned back to the group and launched into a story about some influencer she'd met at a women's leadership brunch. Just like that, I was dismissed again, but I couldn't focus on her voice anymore. Eric's words kept playing over and over in my mind. The trust fund. I always assumed our grandparents had left some money for us. They'd passed when I was in high school. No one really talked specifics, just vague nods to putting it towards Sarah's education and how I was better off figuring things out on my own. At the time, I was too busy juggling school and my part-time job to question it. Besides, they made it sound like there wasn't much left. But now I was staring at my parents across the table, watching as my dad poured Sarah another glass of wine while Mom adjusted the shawl around her shoulders like she was royalty. And a deep, heavy stone settled in my chest. I needed answers. After dinner, the family split up to mingle across the courtyard. I caught Eric by the bar. "You're not just messing with me, right?" I asked low. "About the trust?" He shook his head, serious now. "I found out by accident a few years ago. My mom, your Aunt Marla, was talking about it at a family brunch. Said your grandparents left each of you around $75,000 to be held in trust until you turned 21. She assumed you used yours for college or something." My stomach dropped. "I didn't see a dime," I said flatly. Eric's mouth tightened. "Then you should ask your parents what happened to it." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling fan spinning like the thoughts in my head. Every memory twisted and reshaped itself. Sarah's tuition, the BMW, the post-grad spa retreats, the fact that she never once seemed to worry about money. The next morning, before breakfast, I cornered my mom outside the main house. She was on the phone, pacing near the hydrangeas, but I stepped right into her path. "Mom, can we talk?" She looked startled, then annoyed. "William, I'm on a call. It's important." With a sigh, she lowered the phone. "What's going on?" I got straight to the point. "Did Grandma and Grandpa leave a trust fund for me?" She blinked. Her expression didn't change, but her body tensed. "Why would you ask that?" "Because Eric told me they did. Said we were both supposed to get 75 grand when we turned 21. I never got anything." Her lips thinned. "That money was used to help the family, William." I stared at her. "The family? Or Sarah?" She didn't answer. I felt my voice rising, sharp with disbelief. "So you just took it? You let me work through school, go into debt, live off ramen, while you gave Sarah a private college, a car, and a salary to send emails for you." Her tone turned brittle. "We did what was best for everyone. You always managed. You didn't need the help." "No," I said, my jaw clenching. "You just decided I didn't deserve it." She opened her mouth like she was going to protest, but nothing came out. I walked away before I could say something I'd regret, or worse, something I wouldn't. After that, the reunion was a blur. I barely made eye contact with anyone. Every polite smile felt fake. Every compliment from extended family about how well I'd turned out felt like a cruel joke. Sarah, of course, was oblivious. She floated through the weekend like a debutante at her coming-out party. On the last day, right before people started packing up, she caught me in the hallway of the main house. "Hey," she said brightly. "You seem kind of quiet this weekend. Everything okay?" I looked at her. For the first time in my life, I really looked. Not as my sister, not as the golden girl, but as someone who'd lived in the center of a lie and never once questioned the cost. "Did you know about the trust fund?" I asked. Her smile faltered. "What? Did you know Mom and Dad used my share to fund your life?" She looked away for a second too long. "They told me they were reallocating some things. For education. They said you didn't need it." I stepped closer. "And you didn't think to ask where mine went?" She bristled. "I was a teenager, William. I didn't know the details. But you never asked. You never cared. You just assumed I'd be fine, like always." "That's not fair," she snapped. "I didn't make those decisions." "No," I said. "You just benefited from them. And you never once looked back." Her face hardened. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder about this family. Maybe if you didn't act like such a martyr, people would include you more." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Include me? You mean like when you planned this entire reunion without even asking if I wanted to be involved? Like when Mom gave a speech praising you for keeping the family together and didn't even mention me?" She folded her arms. "This isn't about me, William. You're making it about me because you're bitter." And there it was. The final twist of the knife. I walked away before I could explode. I spent the next few weeks back home in my apartment, replaying every moment like a bad movie I couldn't stop watching. I didn't call my parents. They didn't call me. I guess they figured I'd cool off, sweep it under the rug like I always had. But something had changed in me. It wasn't just about the money. It was the betrayal. The quiet, insidious way they'd carved me out of the picture and called it independence. The way they propped Sarah up with stolen bricks from my foundation and then applauded her for standing tall. And then came the final straw. A letter in the mail. From a law office in town. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I opened it. It was a statement. A summary of the trust fund accounts from 15 years ago. How it had been split. When it was cashed out. Where the funds were transferred. My name was on it. But the account had been drained in 2009. The same year Sarah went off to college. The memo line on the withdrawal? Tuition. No mention of me. No record of consent. No co-signature. They'd taken it. Cashed out my future for hers. I didn't sleep that night either. For weeks, I didn't talk to anyone in my family. No texts. No calls. No birthday messages. I let the silence speak for me. And you know what? Nobody noticed. Or if they did, they chose not to care. The thing about being invisible your whole life is, when you finally disappear, people aren't surprised. They just assume you've gone off to be independent again. And for a while, I didn't correct them. I was angry. Not just at my parents, not just at Sarah, but at myself. For believing them. For playing along. For treating their neglect like some kind of twisted compliment. I kept thinking back to all those nights I sat alone in my dorm eating chili while Sarah sent Instagram stories from wine tastings and ski trips. I remembered calling home to tell Mom about my first promotion and how she said, "That's nice, dear," before asking if I thought Sarah's new logo looked better in navy or teal. All of it came crashing down now. Years of overlooked effort. The constant, quiet ache of being the backup plan. It was grief, really. I was mourning a version of my family that never existed. And grief has a way of making you still. For a while, I stopped coding. I slept in. I missed deadlines on freelance projects I would have once killed for. The business I had poured so much of myself into suddenly felt hollow. What was the point of working so hard if no one ever saw it? If the people who raised me could take my success and reduce it to a footnote in Sarah's story? One night, about a month after the reunion, I sat on my couch staring at my TV, volume off, screen black, and thought about shutting it all down. The company, the contracts, the LLC, just vanishing, getting a regular job, disappearing into the blur of adult life. No expectations, no betrayal, just quiet. But something stopped me. It was a comment on my company's feedback page. I hadn't checked it in weeks. But this one, left by a small business owner from Minnesota, hit different. All I can say is thank you. Your budgeting software helped me get out of debt and finally afford health insurance for my kids. I hope you keep building, because people like me need people like you. I read it 3 times. That woman didn't care if my family liked me. She didn't care if I drove a used car or if my parents thought my work was cute. She cared that I made something that helped her. That mattered. And I realized I had spent so long chasing validation from people who never intended to give it that I lost sight of the people who already saw me. So I got off the couch. I opened my laptop. And I got to work. First, I cleaned house. Ended contracts with 2 toxic clients who were underpaying me and constantly shifting deadlines. I raised my rates and restructured my offerings into packages I could actually manage without burning out. Then I reached out to a few design friends and invested in a full rebrand. New site, updated app UI, sleek onboarding experience. I applied for an accelerator program for minority-owned tech startups. The pitch process was brutal, but I leaned into it. I told my story. Not the sob story, just the truth. Built it myself. No seed funding. No family money. Real growth. Real users. Real results. I got in. The funding wasn't life-changing. $50K in seed cash and a 3-month mentorship pipeline. But it was something better. It was recognition. From strangers. From people who weren't looking at me through the lens of, well, at least you're doing okay for yourself. They saw potential, and they helped me sharpen it. During that program, I met investors, collaborators, even a startup lawyer who offered to help me for free until I hit my next revenue milestone. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was building something in the dark. And then came the call that changed everything. It was from a CFO at a mid-sized healthcare company. They'd seen a demo of my app at a networking event I couldn't even attend in person. Someone else had presented it, said this guy built it solo, no debt, no outside help. The CFO wanted a custom version tailored to their internal staff, and they were willing to pay more than I'd made in the last year combined. We signed a 6-month contract, half up front. By the end of that week, I'd paid off the rest of my student loans and moved out of my 1-bedroom apartment into a modest but sun-filled townhouse in a quiet part of the city. Nothing flashy, just clean air and space to breathe. And here's the thing, I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not Sarah. Not even Eric. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I needed this win to be mine. I wanted to feel what it was like to grow without anyone else's shadow falling over me. But the universe has a funny way of pulling people back in at the worst, or best, moments. 3 months later, I got a text from my dad. Dad, hey Will, hope you're doing okay. Could use your help with something when you get a chance. No, sorry. No, let's talk. Just a favor. I ignored it. 2 days later, a voicemail from my mom. William, I know you're upset, but we really need to speak with you. Your father and I have run into a bit of a financial snag and could use some guidance. Sarah's been very stressed, and it's affecting her work with me. Call us back. There it was. The first time they reached out to me in months, maybe years, and it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask for help, and not even directly. Just the vague suggestion that I owed them a conversation. Part of me wanted to delete the message and move on. But the other part, the one that spent decades being overlooked, dismissed, diminished, leaned forward. I called Eric. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, thought you were dead. Not dead. Just busy. I heard. Rumor has it you landed a healthcare contract. That true? I smiled. Yeah, and some other stuff. I've been building. He was quiet for a second. Then, proud of you, man. Seriously, that meant more than I expected. I hesitated. I need a favor. Shoot. I want to know everything. About the trust fund. About what mom and dad said. About what Sarah knew. Anything you've heard over the years. Eric didn't hesitate. I can do better. I have some emails. Aunt Marla forwarded them once by accident. Copies of conversations between your mom and the trustee. She was bragging about how smart she was for consolidating the accounts to avoid taxes. Said it was better that way. Cleaner. My blood went cold. You still have those? Yup. You want them? I want everything. And just like that, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I didn't rush. That's the part people never understand about revenge. It's not about blowing up someone's life overnight. That's just noise. The real power is in the silence before the strike, in letting them feel safe, smug, maybe even forgiven. Because when the fall finally comes, it doesn't just hurt, it disorients. Eric sent me the emails the next day. I don't know what I expected, but there was something uniquely disgusting about reading my mother's words in plain black text, bragging to a family friend about how she'd reallocated my portion of the trust to avoid what she called pointless taxation on William's future. As if my future wasn't real. As if I was just a temporary inconvenience that could be patched over with financial gymnastics. The email chain started in early 2009, right before Sarah's freshman year. One message in particular hit hard. We've decided to use both trust accounts for Sarah's tuition. It's a better long-term investment for the family. William won't need the money. He's gotten into a state school and can work part-time. That's more his style anyway. He's practical. Sarah is the one with vision. I sat in silence after reading it. Not angry. Not even shocked anymore. Just hollow. They made that decision like I wasn't even a person. But that last line, Sarah is the one with vision. That was the one that stuck in my ribs. Because it wasn't just favoritism. It was dismissal. Condescension. A statement that I didn't have potential. That I wasn't worth the same investment. And the irony? I had vision. Just not the kind they were looking for. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully documenting everything. I compiled the emails, downloaded financial reports from the law office, and had Eric notarize a written affidavit stating what he knew and how he came to learn about it. I hired a forensic accountant to go through my grandparents' estate distribution records and flag any irregularities. He found a dozen. Transfers that should have been split were consolidated into a single account under my mother's name. He even traced the tuition payments, straight from the trust into the bursar's office at Sarah's college. I didn't want money back. Not really. What I wanted was acknowledgement. Exposure. I wanted them to see what it felt like to be helpless while someone else played God with your future. But most of all, I wanted the next move to be on my terms. And then, opportunity walked through my door. Her name was Monica Alvarez. She was one of the mentors I'd met during the Startup Accelerator, a strategic consultant who worked with small firms transitioning into large-scale operations. She was sharp, direct, and had a sense for blood in the water. When I told her, vaguely, about the family drama, she tilted her head. You're telling me they used a trust meant for you without your consent, funded your sister's entire life, and still think you owe them emotional support? Pretty much. And now they want help from you. Yeah. She leaned back in her chair. Then don't just help them. Own them. At first, I thought she was kidding. But then she smiled slowly and pulled out her iPad. Tell me everything about what your mom's consultancy actually does. So I did. And as it turned out, my mom's business was smoke. It wasn't a full consultancy, not really. It was a boutique HR service that operated in a narrow niche, helping wellness influencers and boutique fitness studios scale their hiring practices. It sounded more legitimate than it was. Most of her work involved writing contracts, doing payroll setups, and managing benefit spreadsheets. She only had 3 regular clients, according to Eric, and one of them was on the verge of backing out due to repeated billing errors Sarah had caused. Apparently, the apprenticeship wasn't going so well behind the scenes. So what's the endgame? Monica asked. I want to show them I was never the backup plan, I said. And I want Sarah to know what it feels like to be sidelined. Then let's give her a lesson in what real vision looks like. Together, we came up with a 3-part plan. No fireworks. No public screaming matches. Just quiet, controlled leverage. Step 1, the offer. I waited 2 more weeks before I finally returned my parents' call. They picked up on the second ring, voices tight with nervous cheer. William, so good to hear from you. Mom chirped. We were just talking about. I know, I said. Eric told me. There was silence on the line. Then Dad cleared his throat. Look, son, we didn't mean to. I'm not calling to rehash the past. I interrupted. I'm calling because I heard your business is struggling, and I think I can help. More silence. I'm expanding, I continued. Hiring a full-time HR consultant. Someone to manage employee onboarding, payroll, compliance. You're good at that, right? The line crackled with confusion. You're offering me a job? Mom asked. I'm offering a contract, I clarified. 6 months. Competitive pay. Flexible hours. Remote work. I'll need references, of course. It was the bait. And they took it. Oh, sweetheart, that would mean so much, she said. You have no idea how much pressure we're under right now. Sarah's been. Sarah wouldn't be involved, I said flatly. This would be your contract. Just you. Professional terms. I could practically hear her calculating. I understand, she said, a little too quickly. That's probably for the best. Step 2, the separation. Once she signed the contract, which included a non-disclosure clause, a non-compete agreement, and a performance review clause, I assigned her her first batch of work. It was legitimate but challenging, streamlining onboarding workflows for a new financial client of mine, cleaning up compliance issues, and restructuring benefit documentation. She did fine. At first. But within a few weeks, her communication lagged. Deadlines slipped. Deliverables came back half-finished. I gave her formal feedback, professionally written, tracked and shared documents, and CC'd Monica on all correspondence. The second month, I reduced her hours based on unmet KPIs, per the contract. The third month, I sent her a warning notice. It wasn't cruel. It was business. And then came the part one was waiting for. Sarah called me. I didn't even know she still had my number. Her name lit up on my screen while I was walking home from a client meeting. I picked up. William, she said, not even trying to hide the frustration. What are you doing to Mom? I'm employing her, I said, which is more than she ever did for me. This is insane. She's exhausted. She's crying every night. You're burying her in work just to make a point. No, I said calmly. I'm paying her to do what she told everyone she was good at. If she can't handle that, maybe she was never the expert she claimed to be. She was quiet for a moment. Then she scoffed. You've changed. No, Sarah, I said. You just never looked close enough to see who I was. She hung up. Step 3, the reveal. The final piece came when I got an invitation to a small local business conference. Nothing huge, just a panel on ethical entrepreneurship and family-run businesses. Monica was speaking on day 2. She asked me to join her. I agreed. At the panel, she opened by talking about trust. How so many entrepreneurs start without it, how they build it with clients, and how sometimes the people closest to you can be the most dishonest. Then she turned the mic over to me. I didn't name names. I didn't call out my family. But I told my story. How my education was paid for by late nights and minimum wage jobs. How I built my company with zero funding. How a trust fund I never received became the fire that forged my independence. And how the people who once dismissed me now worked for me, on my terms. The room was silent. And then they applauded. Later that evening, I got a text. It was from Sarah. Sarah, I hope it was worth it. I didn't reply. Because it wasn't about worth. It was about truth. And now, all the pieces were in place. This was closure. This was for every dinner I sat through, invisible. For every time they told me I was doing fine on my own, while secretly stealing from me to fund Sarah's dream life. This was for the boy they forgot and the man they never saw coming. It began with a letter. A formal, emotionless letter drafted by Monica's legal team and sent via certified mail to both of my parents. Inside was a detailed breakdown of the trust fund irregularities, complete with dates, bank statements, and the emails Eric had dug up. It laid out the misuse of my share, the lack of disclosure, and the unethical redirection of funds from a minor's designated inheritance. No threats, no demands, just facts. 2 days later, I got a voicemail from my mother. She sounded frantic, breathless. William, I don't know what this is, where this is coming from. We did what we thought was right. Please, can we talk? This is all a misunderstanding. It wasn't. I waited a week before responding. When I did, it was through my lawyer. We weren't suing them. That wasn't the goal. But the letter clarified that I could, if I wanted to. It cited precedent cases. Included rough damages based on what the money would have been worth today with interest. It stopped just short of filing a claim, but it made the consequences very, very clear. And then came the second letter. This one was addressed to the 3 clients of my mother's consultancy. It was written by a different lawyer, an advisor of mine who specialized in business integrity. It didn't accuse her of criminal activity. It simply outlined concerns around past misuse of funds, incomplete reporting, and an active performance issue I had documented through our contract. The goal wasn't to destroy her. It was to make sure she couldn't hide behind her carefully curated boss lady persona anymore. The truth was out, and people were watching. The fallout was immediate. One client dropped her within the week. The second one called for an audit of the last 12 months of services. The third client, which happened to be a boutique yoga studio chain with a growing online presence, called me. Their COO had attended the conference where I spoke. She asked if I'd be interested in consulting directly. I said yes. Within a month, my mother's business was down to a trickle. No more spa retreats. No more backpatting brunches. Just a desk, a cluttered inbox, and a reputation that no amount of Pinterest quotes could fix. And Sarah? Oh, Sarah felt the tremor too. Without the consultancy to hide inside, she was suddenly expected to stand on her own. Clients no longer tolerated her missed emails or tone-deaf branding suggestions. The bubble burst. The apprenticeship ended. I don't know where she works now. I heard through Eric that she's doing freelance marketing for a few small local businesses. Nothing stable. The BMW lease ended. The influencer brunches stopped. And the last time she posted on social media, the caption read, "Starting over is hard, but necessary." No mention of why. As for my parents, the silence grew louder. They stopped trying to reach out. I think they realized, finally, that I wasn't their safety net. That they couldn't call me when they needed help without acknowledging how badly they'd burned the bridge. But it wasn't just about punishment. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I just wanted them to feel it. The weight of what they'd done. The cost of erasing your own child from the picture and pretending it was love. The only person I did stay in touch with was Eric. He came by my new place a few months later, walking through the front door with a bottle of whiskey and a stupid grin. "I saw the new press release," he said. "Congratulations, man. National rollout. That's insane." I smiled. "Thanks. It still feels surreal." We sat out on the balcony that night, watching the city lights blink like quiet applause, and for the first time in years, I felt still. Not stuck. Just settled. Eric raised his glass. To doing it without them. I raised mine back. To seeing them for who they really are. That night, I slept better than I had in a decade. But there was one final thing I needed to do. Something for me. I opened an old email thread, one I'd archived years ago. It was the chain where I sent Sarah that budgeting app one built in college. The one she never opened. The one she called cute. I clicked forward. Added a message. "Thought you might need this now. It's better than cute these days. Actually works. Just like I always did." And then I hit send. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't need one. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't hoping for recognition. I had already won. And I built it all from nothing they gave me. From scraps and silence and shadows. Independent, they called me. They were right. But they had no idea just how far I'd rise. And now? Now I never have to look back. I didn't realize how little I mattered to my parents until the day they told me I was too self-sufficient to worry about. They said it casually, like it was a compliment, like it explained everything. I was 28 at the time, sitting at the small kitchen table in the house I grew up in, watching my mother slide a stack of papers toward my sister while my dad nodded approvingly. That was the day they signed the family property over to her. Not because she earned it, not because she needed it more, but because, according to them, I'd be fine no matter what. My name is Elvis. I'm 34 now, and this is the story of how being reliable quietly made me disposable. Growing up, I was the easy one. The kid who didn't cause problems, didn't need reminders, didn't ask for much. If something needed fixing, I figured it out. If money was tight, I took extra shifts. If plans fell apart, I adjusted. My parents used to joke that I came out of the womb with a checklist. My sister, Marissa, was the opposite. She was emotional, impulsive, always in some kind of crisis that required immediate attention. Late rent, dropped classes, another relationship that ended badly, another big idea that needed funding. My parents hovered around her like she was fragile glass, while I learned early that praise was something you got for not needing help. By my early 20s, the pattern was obvious. When Marissa needed something, the family rearranged itself. When I needed something, I was told I'd figure it out. And I did. I moved out early, worked my way up in a logistics firm, paid my own tuition part-time, built savings. I showed up to every holiday, every birthday, every last-minute favor. I drove my dad to appointments when his knee started acting up. I fixed the leaking roof on weekends. I handled paperwork they didn't want to deal with. I thought that counted for something. The property was always this unspoken thing hanging in the background. A modest but valuable piece of land with the old family house on it, fully paid off, passed down from my grandparents. My parents talked about it like it was sacred. One day, this will keep the family secure, my dad used to say. I assumed that meant it would be handled responsibly. Maybe split. Maybe sold and divided. Maybe kept as a safety net for everyone. I never imagined I'd be sitting at that table watching it be handed over like a consolation prize. They didn't even frame it as a discussion. My mom cleared her throat and said they'd been thinking about the future. My dad said Marissa needed stability. Then came the line I still hear in my head. You're strong, Elvis. You don't need a safety net. Your sister does. I remember looking at the papers, at Marissa's signature line already filled out, and feeling something quietly crack. Not rage, not shock, just this slow, sinking realization that my role had already been decided, and no one thought to ask how I felt about it. Marissa avoided my eyes the whole time. She kept talking about plans, renovations, turning part of the house into a rental, using the equity to start a business. My parents nodded like proud investors. I asked one question carefully about loans, about debt, about what would happen if things didn't work out. My dad smiled and said I worried too much. My mom said we had to trust family. Then she added, almost kindly, you've always landed on your feet. We know you'll be okay. I drove home that night in silence. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't make it a scene. That's the part people always expect, the big confrontation. But something about being told you don't matter because you're competent takes the wind out of you. It turns anger inward. It makes you wonder when exactly being dependable stopped being a virtue and started being an excuse to overlook you. Over the next few years, the distance grew. Marissa took out loan after loan against the property. Every time she called, it was to talk about the next big thing, the next expansion, the next temporary setback. My parents backed her every time. When I cautioned them, gently, they accused me of being negative. When I offered to look over contracts, they said Marissa had it handled. When I stopped offering, no one noticed. Meanwhile, my own life kept moving. Promotions, relocations, long hours that paid off. I bought my own place without telling them until after the papers were signed. My mom said she was proud, but there was something flat in her voice, like my achievements were expected, not celebrated. My dad joked that I didn't need them anymore. I laughed along, because that's what I'd always done. The first real crack came when Marissa missed a loan payment. Then another. Suddenly, family dinners included tense whispers and phone calls taken in the other room. My parents started asking me questions again. What did I think they should do? Could I look at something real quick? I helped where I could, out of habit more than hope. But I could see where it was going long before they admitted it. The night they finally came to me, asking for help, wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No tears at first. Just my parents sitting in my living room, older than I remembered, hands folded, talking about foreclosure notices and stress and how they didn't sleep anymore. My mom said they were scared. My dad said they needed stability. Then he looked at me and said, "You've always been the responsible one." That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly. I nodded. I listened. I made coffee. But inside, I felt the weight of every time I'd been told I was fine. I didn't need support. I'd land on my feet. Now, suddenly, my independence was being reframed as a resource they could draw from. A solution to a problem I'd warned them about years earlier. I told them I needed time to think. That was true. What I didn't say was that I'd already been thinking for a long time. About fairness. About boundaries. About what family actually means when responsibility only flows one way. A week later, while they waited for my answer, I got a call from my company. The promotion I'd been working toward for years was finally on the table. New city. More responsibility. A clean break. I didn't tell my parents right away. I let the silence stretch. Their calls became more frequent, more urgent. My mom started framing things differently, talking about sacrifices, about how families stick together when things get hard. My dad mentioned how much they'd done for me growing up. Each conversation added another layer of pressure, another reminder that my value, in their eyes, had always been tied to what I could carry for others. The night before I was supposed to give them an answer, my sister called me. Not to apologize. Not to take responsibility. She said she needed me to step up. That it was unfair for me to walk away when everyone else was struggling. She said, "You don't even need that promotion. You're already doing fine." I stared at my phone after she hung up, the words echoing in my head. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about money or property. It was about a lifetime of being told my strength made me optional. I opened my email, reread the offer, and imagined what it would mean to finally choose myself. By the time my parents came over the next evening, their faces tight with expectation, I already knew what I was going to say. They came over the next evening with a tone that told me they thought the decision was already made. My mom brought a folder. My dad brought that familiar tight smile he used whenever he wanted to sound calm while steering a conversation in a specific direction. They sat on my couch like guests waiting for good news, not parents asking for help. Before I could even say anything, my mom started talking about timelines. How quickly the bank was moving. How if I stepped in now, everything could still be saved. She said it like it was a shared problem, like I had been part of the choices that led them here. I listened. That's important. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I let them explain the situation in full, all the way down to numbers and deadlines and worst-case scenarios. My dad talked about how embarrassed he was, how he never thought he'd be in this position. Then, without missing a beat, he said, "But that's why we raised you the way we did, so you could handle things like this." Something in my chest tightened at that sentence. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. They really believed this was the natural outcome of our family dynamic. That the reward for being responsible was inheriting everyone else's mess. When I finally spoke, I told them about the promotion. I didn't frame it as leverage. I just said it plainly. New role, different city, bigger commitment. My mom's face fell immediately. My dad leaned back like I'd physically pushed him. There was a long silence. And then my mom said, "So you're leaving now? When we need you?" I said I hadn't accepted yet, that it was an option, that I was weighing things. That part was true. What I didn't say was how their reaction had already tipped the scale. There was no congratulations, no pride, just disappointment, like my success was an inconvenience. That's when the conversation shifted. The tone changed. My mom started talking about everything they'd done for me growing up. The sacrifices, the roof over my head, the food on the table. My dad added stories about long hours he worked when I was a kid, like it was a debt ledger he'd been quietly keeping all these years. I'd heard versions of this before, but never this directly. Never with this expectation attached to it. I reminded them, carefully, that they'd made their decision about the property years ago, that I hadn't been consulted, that I'd voiced concerns that were dismissed. My dad waved his hand and said that wasn't relevant anymore. Families adjust, he said. We didn't know things would turn out like this. That was the first moment I felt real anger rise up. Not explosive anger. The kind that's cold and steady and sharp. Because they had known. Maybe not the exact details, but the pattern. The risk. The imbalance. They just assumed it wouldn't land on them. And if it did, I'd be there to catch it. When I didn't immediately agree to help, my mom's voice got tighter. She asked what kind of son lets his parents lose their home. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just let the words hang there, heavy and loaded. I felt my jaw clench. I asked her, calmly, what kind of parents decide one child deserves security and the other deserves responsibility without a say? She looked genuinely confused by the question. That's what hurt the most. Not offended. Not defensive. Confused. Like the idea that the decision had been unfair had never occurred to her. They left that night without a resolution, but the pressure didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. My phone started buzzing constantly. Calls. Texts. Messages framed as updates, but really designed to build urgency. The bank called again. We might need to make a decision this week. Your sister is under a lot of stress. Every message carried the same unspoken assumption that I would step in eventually, that this was just a matter of timing. Marissa ramped things up too. She stopped pretending this was about shared responsibility and started treating it like an obligation. She showed up at my place unannounced one afternoon, pacing my living room like she owned it. She told me I was being dramatic, that everyone was struggling, that if roles were reversed, she'd help me. I almost laughed at that, but something in her tone stopped me. She believed it. She genuinely believed she'd do the same for me, despite years of evidence to the contrary. I asked her a simple question. If the property had been signed over to me, and I'd run it into the ground, would she be offering to cover the fallout? She didn't answer. She changed the subject. That was answer enough. The real breaking point came a week later, when my parents asked me to come over to talk things through. I walked into the old house and immediately noticed something was off. Papers spread across the dining table. Not just bank documents. Legal ones. My dad looked tired. My mom looked determined. They told me they'd spoken to an advisor. That there might be a way to restructure things. To transfer some responsibility. My stomach dropped before they even finished explaining. They wanted me to co-sign. Not temporarily. Not as a last resort. As a long-term solution. They framed it as a technicality, a way to reassure the bank. My name, my credit, my future, tied to a property I didn't own and decisions I didn't control. When I pointed that out, my dad said, "It's just on paper. You know we'd never let it affect you." That was the moment I realized how completely they misunderstood what they were asking. Or maybe they understood and just didn't care. Because when I said no, clearly and without hesitation, my mom's composure finally cracked. She accused me of abandoning the family, of choosing money over people, of punishing them for a decision they'd made with good intentions. I told her the truth then, that the decision hadn't just hurt me financially. It had taught me exactly where I stood, that being too self-sufficient to matter meant my needs were optional, my opinions disposable, my boundaries inconvenient. I said it quietly. I didn't raise my voice, but every word landed hard. That's when my dad said something I don't think he realized would change everything. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said, "If you'd needed help like your sister, things might have been different." There it was. The confirmation I didn't know I'd been waiting for. Not denial. Not justification. Confirmation. That my reliability had cost me a place at the table. That if I'd struggled more, failed louder, demanded attention, I might have been considered worth protecting. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't. I told them I wasn't co-signing anything. I told them I wasn't stepping in to fix this. And I told them I was taking the promotion. My mom started crying then. Real tears, and for a second I almost wavered. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But then she said something that sealed it. She said, "I never thought you'd be this selfish." I looked around that house. At the walls I'd painted. The repairs I'd done. The weekends I'd given up. And I realized this was the story they'd always tell, no matter what I did. I left without another word. The fallout was immediate. Relatives started calling. Some were subtle. Others weren't. I was told I was cold. Calculating. That success had changed me. No one asked why I was the only one being asked to sacrifice. No one questioned the decisions that led here. They just wanted a solution, and I was the most convenient one. The night before I was supposed to give my final answer to my company, my dad called me alone. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. He said the bank had given them a final deadline. He said he didn't know what they were going to do. Then he said, "I thought you'd always be there." I sat there in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of that expectation settle fully on my shoulders. Not as love, as certainty. And as I stared at the email confirmation for my new role, one thought kept repeating in my head. If I give in now, this never ends. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was torn about the promotion, but because my entire understanding of my family had finally collapsed, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment that led there. Every favor, every dismissal, every time I'd been praised for being low maintenance, like it was a virtue instead of a warning label. By morning, the exhaustion settled into something heavier than sadness. It felt like grief, but not for the house or the money. I was grieving the version of my parents I thought I had. I accepted the promotion before sunrise. I didn't dramatize it. No long speech. No satisfaction. I just clicked the button, read the confirmation twice, and sat there staring at the wall while my coffee went cold. When the relief finally came, it wasn't the kind people talk about. It was quiet, almost numb, like stepping out of a building after a fire alarm and realizing you're still shaking even though you're safe. Telling my parents was harder than accepting the job, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew exactly how they'd hear it. I waited a few days, long enough for the bank's deadline to pass, long enough for the consequences to feel real. When I finally called, my mom didn't answer. My dad did. His voice sounded older, tired in a way that went beyond stress. I told him I was moving, that I'd accepted the role. There was a long silence. Then he said, "So that's it." Not a question, a conclusion. I said I loved them. I said I hoped things worked out. He said nothing else before hanging up. That was the last normal conversation we ever had. What followed was the worst stretch of my life, and not because I was struggling financially or professionally. On paper, I was doing better than ever. New city, bigger salary, more responsibility. But emotionally, I was hollow. I'd lost my anchor. The people who were supposed to be my constant had turned into something unpredictable and conditional. I went days without talking to anyone outside of work. I unpacked my apartment slowly, like I wasn't sure I deserved to settle in. The guilt hit me in waves. Late at night, early mornings, random moments at work when I'd catch myself zoning out. I wondered if I'd done the right thing. If maybe I should have helped just a little. If drawing a hard line had been cruel. That internal debate was relentless because it wasn't really about money or responsibility. It was about identity. For most of my life, I'd been the one who showed up. The fixer. The reliable one. Walking away felt like abandoning not just my parents, but a version of myself I'd spent decades becoming. Then the calls stopped. Not gradually. All at once. No more updates. No more pressure. Just silence. At first, it hurt. Then it scared me. Then it confused me. And finally, it clarified something I hadn't wanted to admit. They didn't miss me. They missed what I could provide. A few weeks later, I found out through a cousin that the foreclosure process had officially begun. The house was going to be listed. My parents were scrambling for temporary housing. Marissa had disappeared from the picture almost entirely, claiming she was overwhelmed and needed space. That part stung more than I expected. Not because I felt responsible, but because it confirmed exactly how alone my parents had been left by the person they'd bet everything on. I didn't reach out. That was a conscious choice, and one I had to recommit to every day. Because every instinct in me wanted to step in, to offer solutions, to smooth things over. That instinct didn't disappear just because I recognized it was unhealthy. It took effort to sit on my hands and let things unfold without me. Work became my refuge. Not in a dramatic, throw myself into it way, but in a grounding one. Clear expectations. Measurable outcomes. Feedback that wasn't tangled in emotional debt. For the first time in my life, I was being evaluated purely on performance, not on how much I could absorb for others. I thrived in that environment, and that scared me at first. It made me realize how much energy I'd spent managing family dynamics instead of investing in myself. The real low point came a few months in, when my mom showed up at my door unannounced. I hadn't given her the address. She must have gotten it from someone at work or through extended family. Seeing her standing there, smaller than I remembered, holding a suitcase she clearly hadn't packed properly, knocked the air out of me. She didn't apologize. She didn't accuse me either. She just said she needed somewhere to sit for a while. That the temporary arrangement they'd made had fallen through. That she didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I almost let her in without thinking. Years of reflex kicked in. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. She wasn't asking. She was assuming. I told her I couldn't. That my place wasn't set up for guests. That my schedule was demanding. All true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that letting her in would have reopened a door I'd just managed to close. Her face hardened immediately. She said she didn't raise me to be like this, that she never thought I'd turn my back on family when things got hard. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just said, quietly, that things had been hard for me for a long time too. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Then she left. I watched her walk down the hallway and disappear into the elevator, feeling like I'd just amputated something necessary to survive. That night, I hit what I can only describe as emotional rock bottom. Not despair. Clarity without comfort. I realized that no amount of success would ever be enough to earn unconditional support from my parents. That the version of love they offered came with terms I could never fully satisfy. Accepting that hurt more than losing the house ever could. The rebuilding didn't start dramatically. There was no big revelation. It started with small things. Therapy, which I'd avoided for years because I didn't think my problems were serious enough. Long walks where I let my thoughts spiral without trying to fix them. Saying no to things at work that weren't my responsibility. Not because I couldn't handle them, but because I didn't need to. I started making friends who didn't know my family history. People who met me as I was, not as a role I'd filled. I learned how strange it felt to be cared about without being needed. It was uncomfortable at first. I kept waiting for the catch, but it never came. Slowly, my sense of self shifted. I stopped measuring my worth by how much chaos I could contain. I started noticing how calm my life was becoming, how my weekends were mine, how my decisions didn't need approval or justification. That calm felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, but it grew on me. The final shift came the day my dad called me again. Months had passed. His voice was different this time. Not demanding, not disappointed, just flat. He told me the house was officially gone, that they were staying with a distant relative for now. He said, "I guess you really meant it when you said you weren't stepping in." I said I had. There was another silence. Then he said something that surprised me. Not an apology, not remorse. Just, "I didn't think you'd choose yourself." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone in my lap, realizing that for the first time in my life, I had. And that choice had cost me more than I expected, but it had also given me something I'd never had before. The freedom to decide who I was without negotiating it with anyone else. I didn't know it yet, but that freedom was about to matter more than ever. The call with my dad lingered with me for weeks. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. No apology. No acknowledgement of the imbalance. Just quiet acceptance that the safety net they'd built for one child and denied the other had finally collapsed. And somehow, even then, I could tell they still didn't fully connect that outcome to their choices. To them, it was just bad luck. Circumstances. Timing. That's when I understood something fundamental. If I ever wanted them to truly grasp what they'd done, words would never be enough. They'd heard my concerns before and dismissed them. They'd heard my boundaries and tried to step over them. If there was going to be any reckoning, it would have to come from consequences they couldn't reframe or talk their way around. The opportunity didn't present itself right away. It never does. Life doesn't hand you neat revenge arcs with clear signposts. What it gave me instead were fragments. Small pieces of information that, on their own, didn't seem like much. But I've always been good at patterns. At noticing how things connect. It started with a voicemail from Marissa. I hadn't heard her voice in months, and hearing it again sent a jolt through me. She sounded frantic. Not dramatic frantic, the way she used to sound when she wanted sympathy. This was different. Tight. Controlled. She said she needed to talk to me. That it was important. That things were getting complicated. I didn't call her back right away. That alone was a new behavior for me. Old Elvis would have dropped everything. New Elvis listened to the message twice, noted what she didn't say, and waited. Over the next few days, more information filtered in through indirect channels. A cousin mentioned Marissa had been asking questions about liability. An aunt casually asked if I'd ever been listed on any family documents. A former family friend, someone who worked adjacent to local real estate, congratulated me on getting out when I did, then stopped talking abruptly when I asked what he meant. That's when I started digging. Quietly. Methodically. I didn't hire anyone at first. I didn't want this traced back to emotion or spite. I pulled public records, property filings, loan documents, anything that was accessible without crossing lines. And the deeper I went, the clearer the picture became. Marissa hadn't just mismanaged the property. She'd leveraged it aggressively. Multiple loans, overlapping timelines, Clauses that transferred risk in ways my parents almost certainly didn't understand. And buried in the paperwork, repeated over and over, was a phrase that made my stomach drop. Personal guarantee contingent on familial support. They hadn't just assumed I'd help. In some cases, they'd implied it. Not legally binding, not directly, but enough to reassure lenders. Enough to paint a picture of a financially stable sibling who could step in if needed. I wasn't named, but I was referenced. The idea of me, the assumption of me. I sat back in my chair and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Even after writing me out of their plans, they'd still built their future on my existence. That was the moment the plan stopped being abstract. I wasn't interested in humiliating them. I wasn't interested in yelling or public confrontations or dramatic reveals. What I wanted was something much simpler and much more devastating. I wanted them to be forced to live inside the reality they'd created without my presence cushioning it. The first step was distance. Not physical, but informational. I stopped responding to extended family inquiries entirely. No explanations. No defenses. Silence has a way of making people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people talk. Within weeks, I was hearing versions of the story that barely resembled the truth. That I'd abandoned my parents. That I'd chosen money over family. That I'd been cold. I let it spread, because the louder the narrative became, the more brittle it was. And brittle stories crack under pressure. The second step was documentation. I started keeping records of everything. Messages, voicemails, indirect requests for help, comments framed as jokes that weren't really jokes at all. I wasn't sure yet how I'd use it, but I knew from experience that memory gets selective when accountability shows up. Around this time, Marissa finally cornered me. She showed up at my office building, claiming she just happened to be in the area. We sat in a neutral space downstairs, surrounded by people who didn't know us. And for the first time in our lives, she didn't have the advantage of history or family sentiment. She didn't waste time. She told me things were worse than I thought. That our parents were struggling more than they were letting on. That creditors were asking questions. That my name had come up. I asked her calmly why. She hesitated. Then she said something that confirmed everything. She said, "They always told people you'd step in if things got really bad." I nodded like this was new information. Inside, everything clicked into place. I asked her one question. Did she ever plan to include me in the upside? If the property had succeeded, if the investments had paid off, would I have seen any of it? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "That's not fair. This isn't about that." But it was. It had always been. I told her I wasn't helping. Not now. Not later. And that if anyone contacted me again implying otherwise, I'd correct the record. Firmly. Publicly, if needed. Her face hardened, and for a moment I saw fear flash through the entitlement. Real fear. The kind that comes when a backup plan realizes it was never actually secured. After that conversation, the tone shifted across the board. My parents stopped asking for help and started talking about misunderstandings. About how maybe things had gotten out of hand. About how families make mistakes. The language softened, but the intent didn't. They weren't apologizing. They were repositioning. That's when I made my final decision about how this would play out. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't need them to suffer. What I needed was resolution. And resolution, I realized, wasn't going to come from confrontation. It was going to come from exposure. So I started preparing. I spoke to a lawyer. Not to sue. Not to threaten. Just to understand. To map out exactly where my obligations began and ended. To make sure there were no lingering ties, no assumptions that could be weaponized later. What I learned was reassuring and infuriating all at once. I was clean. Completely. Every attempt to link me to the fallout had been informal. Emotional. Assumptive. In other words, they had nothing on me. Except expectation. The last piece fell into place when my company announced an internal restructuring. A public-facing one. Press releases. Industry attention. My new role came with visibility I hadn't anticipated. Panels. Interviews. Features. The kind of professional credibility my parents used to brag about when it suited them. And suddenly, I realized the timing was perfect. Because when people who've rewritten the story about you are forced to watch the real version play out without their involvement, without their control, something interesting happens. They can't pretend anymore. Not to themselves. Not to others. I didn't know exactly how the final confrontation would unfold yet. I just knew I was done hiding. Done absorbing. Done being the invisible foundation everyone stood on without acknowledging. The reckoning didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do, wrapped in timing and inevitability. By the time my parents realized what was happening, there was nothing left to argue about. The first public moment came sooner than expected. My company announced a major expansion initiative, and my role was featured prominently in the release. Industry blogs picked it up. A trade publication asked for an interview. A local business journal ran a profile that included my background, my career path, and a quote about independence and accountability that I hadn't even thought twice about when I said it. I talked about building stability through consistent choices, about not outsourcing responsibility, about learning when to step back and let people own the outcomes of their decisions. I didn't mention my family. I didn't have to. Someone else did that for me. An old family friend commented on one of the articles online, congratulating me and adding, "Your parents must be so proud." The reply chain that followed was educational. People who knew pieces of the story filled in gaps. Not maliciously, matter-of-factly. The house, the loans, the foreclosure, the fact that I hadn't been involved, that I'd moved on years earlier. By the time my mom called me that evening, the narrative had shifted beyond her control. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sounded stunned. She asked why I hadn't corrected people, why I'd let them think things that made her look bad. I told her, calmly, that I hadn't said anything at all, that I wasn't responsible for managing other people's assumptions anymore. There was a long pause, and then she said something I hadn't heard before. She said, "I didn't realize people would see it that way." That was the moment it finally hit her. Not because of my feelings, not because of fairness, but because the story they'd told themselves didn't hold up once it left the family bubble. When the same choices were viewed without emotional cushioning, they looked exactly like what they were. My dad tried a different approach. He called a few days later and asked to meet in person. Neutral place. Coffee shop. No audience. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to close the loop cleanly. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller. Not broken, but stripped of certainty. We talked for a while about neutral things. The weather. The city. My job. Then he finally said what he'd come to say. He said they'd made mistakes. That they'd assumed I didn't need them. That they'd leaned too hard on the idea that I'd always be there. He didn't apologize directly, but he didn't deflect either. It was the closest he'd ever come to accountability. I listened. Then I told him the truth. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, that I didn't hate them, but that I also wasn't coming back into the role they'd designed for me. That my life was stable now because it didn't revolve around cleaning up other people's choices. That stepping in now wouldn't fix anything. It would just restart the cycle. He asked if there was anything they could do. I said yes. I said they could stop telling people I'd abandoned them. Stop implying I'd promised things I hadn't. Stop framing my boundaries as punishment. I said if they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be one that didn't assume access to my time, money, or decisions. He nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing terms they didn't get to negotiate. Marissa didn't take it as well. When it became clear that I wasn't stepping in and that the extended family no longer viewed me as the villain, she unraveled publicly. She blamed the banks, the market, our parents, me. She told anyone who would listen that I'd changed. That success had made me cold. But something interesting happened. People started asking questions. Specific ones. About timelines. About decisions. About why she'd taken risks she couldn't back up. She stopped answering those questions. Eventually, she stopped showing up to family gatherings altogether. Last I heard, she'd moved again, chasing another opportunity, another reset. My parents followed a quieter path. Downsized. Adjusted. Learned, too late, what it meant to live without a safety net they'd assumed would always exist. The final moment came months later, on a random weekday afternoon. My mom sent me a message. Not asking for help. Not asking for money. Just a simple statement. She said, "I understand now why you stepped away." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Then I sent back one sentence. I didn't step away. I stopped holding everything up alone. We don't talk often now. When we do, it's different. Careful. Limited. Real in a way it never was before. There's grief in that distance, but there's also peace. I no longer measure my worth by how much I can endure for others. I no longer confuse being needed with being loved. The revenge wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't involve confrontation or humiliation. It was simply this. I lived the life they'd always assumed I'd sacrifice, and I did it without them. And in doing so, I finally learned what independence actually means. I found my wife's secret notebook where she wrote, "Once his business takes off, I'll divorce him and take half." I smiled, said nothing, until the day she handed me the papers. I, 38M, always thought I had a solid read on people. I wasn't the type to get played. At least, that's what I used to believe. But as it turns out, you can sleep next to someone for nearly a decade and not really know who they are. My wife, Celeste, 35F, and I met when we were both in our late 20s. She had this effortless charm about her, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and have everyone's attention without even trying. She was sharp, ambitious, and had this way of making you feel like the most important person in the world when she talked to you. We clicked right away. At the time, I was working as an engineer for a mid-sized firm, but I had bigger plans. I wanted to start my own company, build something from the ground up. Celeste was one of the first people I ever told about it, and I still remember how her eyes lit up when I did. "You're going to make it," she told me, squeezing my hand. "You just need someone who believes in you." And I did. Believe in myself, I mean. But having her in my corner? That made it all feel more real. We got married after 2 years of dating, and for a while, things were good. Really good. Celeste had a career in marketing, and I kept working my way up, saving every penny I could for my future business. She was always right there beside me, telling me she couldn't wait for the day I was my own boss. At least, that's what I thought. Looking back, there were things I ignored. Little things, like how she never wanted to talk about my work in depth. She was happy to hear about promotions, salary bumps, anything that meant more stability. But the second I brought up my business idea, the conversations were always short. She'd smile, say something encouraging, and then change the subject. I chalked it up to stress. After all, we had bills to pay, a mortgage to think about. Maybe she just didn't want to get too caught up in something that wasn't guaranteed. But then, 3 years ago, I finally took the leap. Quit my job, started my own business, and that's when everything changed. At first, I was too caught up in the struggle to notice. I was pulling 18-hour days, barely sleeping, pouring everything I had into getting the company off the ground. Celeste was supportive, at least on the surface. She never outright complained, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. "You work too much," she'd say with a sigh, swirling a glass of wine at the dinner table while I scarfed down whatever takeout she'd picked up. We never do anything anymore. I tried to make time for her. I really did. But it was impossible. The business wasn't profitable yet, and I couldn't afford to slow down. Then, just when I was starting to wonder if I'd made a mistake, things finally started turning around. Clients started rolling in. The long nights were paying off. I wasn't just making money. I was making real money, the kind that meant we didn't have to worry anymore. And suddenly, Celeste wasn't distant anymore. She was back to being the woman I had married, laughing at my jokes, bragging to her friends about my success, talking about our future, how we could finally take that vacation, buy a bigger house, invest in something together. I remember feeling relieved, like I had survived the hardest part, and now we could just enjoy what I had built. I was wrong. It started with a notebook. Celeste had this sleek, navy blue notebook she carried everywhere. She used it for work, jotting down ideas, brainstorming strategies. I never had a reason to look inside. Until one night, she left it on the kitchen counter. And for some reason, my name caught my eye. I don't know what made me open it, but I did. And what I found inside, I had to sit down. The first few pages were normal, work notes, some marketing ideas. But buried between them, mixed in like afterthoughts, were notes about me. About us. To-do list. Keep being supportive until revenue stabilizes. Start talking about joint investments. Once he crosses X income, bring up property in my name. Once his business takes off, I'll divorce him and take half. There was more. So much more. Dates, details, observations about me. How much money I had in liquid assets. Mentions of divorce lawyers. She had been planning this for years, and I never saw it coming. But I didn't lose my temper. I didn't wake her up. I didn't say a word. I just smiled. And from that moment on, I played along. She thought she had me fooled. She had no idea. Then came the day she handed me the divorce papers. Celeste handed me the papers on a Sunday morning. It was a perfect day, the kind where the sun streamed through the windows just right, making the kitchen feel warm and golden. She had even made coffee, black for me, vanilla creamer for her. A small, almost thoughtful gesture. But then she sat down across from me, slid a manila envelope onto the table, and just smiled. I knew it was coming. I had known for months. But seeing it there in front of me, it still made my stomach tighten. "I've been thinking," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug, nails perfectly manicured like always. "We've grown apart, haven't we?" She said it so gently, like it was just a sad, inevitable truth. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was wearing that soft blue sweater I'd bought her last Christmas. The same one she had gushed over, saying I knew her taste better than she did. And here she was now, sitting across from me, treating me like a business transaction she had finally decided to close. I kept my expression neutral, like I was processing, like this was some kind of shock. "You want a divorce?" Her lips pressed together in that careful way she always did when she was trying to seem empathetic. "I think it's for the best, don't you?" I almost laughed. Instead, I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands. "This is a lot," I murmured, like a man caught off guard. I thumbed the flap, pretending to hesitate before sliding the papers out. Her signature was already there. She had been ready for this. "I don't want this to get ugly," she continued, leaning in slightly. "I know things have been tense, but we're both adults. We can be fair about this." Fair. The word nearly made me clench my teeth. I flipped through the papers, slow and deliberate, letting her watch me read them. She wanted half. Half of everything. Not just the savings, but the business. The one I had built. The one she had never truly believed in. She was even pushing for spousal support, despite the fact that she had her own income. And yet, her voice was so soft, so reasonable, like she was doing me a favor. "I know you're upset," she said after a moment of silence. "But this is what's best for both of us. I really do want us to stay on good terms." I looked up at her, taking in the slight furrow of her brow, the calculated concern in her eyes. She had no idea. I nodded slowly, setting the papers down. "I just need a little time." She smiled, relieved. "Of course. Take as long as you need." I almost pitied her. She thought she had won. But Celeste didn't know that I had seen her notebook. She didn't know that I had spent the past few months preparing, that I had been playing along, setting the stage, making sure that when this moment came, she would be the one caught off guard. So I picked up my coffee, took a slow sip, and smiled back. I spent the next few days acting like a man who was blindsided. Celeste didn't push. She was smart enough to give me space, letting me sit with the so-called shock of our impending divorce. But I could see the way she watched me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, gauging my reactions, probably trying to figure out if I'd go along quietly or if I'd fight. I had no intention of fighting, not in the way she expected, at least. I still went through the motions of our daily life. Ate dinner at the same table, slept in the same bed, let her kiss my cheek in the mornings like she always did, like we were just another married couple navigating an amicable split. And all the while, I was setting the final pieces into place. Celeste had made a mistake, not in underestimating me. She had done that long ago, but in assuming I was the same man I had been when I started my business. Back then, I had been an idealist, someone who thought hard work and loyalty were enough. But running a business changes you. You learn how to negotiate, how to read people, how to anticipate their next move before they even make it. And most importantly, you learn how to protect yourself. Celeste wanted half of everything, but what she didn't know was that for the past 6 months, I had been making sure there was nothing for her to take. See, when I found her notebook, I knew I couldn't react. If I had confronted her, she would have just adjusted, been more careful, maybe even manipulated me into doubting what I saw. So instead, I had taken my time. I restructured my company, moved assets, transferred key accounts into a separate entity under a silent partner, one I trusted. On paper, my personal worth had steadily decreased while the business continued to thrive. And then there was the house. Celeste thought she was entitled to half of our home, but what she failed to realize was that, months ago, I had refinanced it, under my name alone. She had signed the papers without reading them, too distracted by a weekend getaway I had oh so thoughtfully planned for her. So now, legally, she had no claim to it. But the best part, the part that I knew would completely blindside her, was that I had quietly gathered evidence. Celeste had been careful in her notebook. No outright confessions, just hints, just plans. But she hadn't been as careful with her conversations. And I had proof. Proof that she had only stayed with me to milk my success. Proof that she had admitted her intentions to certain people, ones who, with the right incentive, had been more than willing to confirm everything. Celeste had spent years crafting the perfect plan. The next morning, I woke up early. Celeste was still asleep, curled up on her side of the bed like nothing had changed. Like she wasn't in the middle of trying to rip my life apart for a payout she hadn't earned. I took my time getting ready, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Today was the day. Today, I turned the tables. By the time Celeste wandered into the kitchen, wrapped in her silk robe, stretching like a satisfied cat, I was already at the table. I had made coffee, just like always. Hers was already poured, steam curling up from the cup. She smiled at me, slow and sweet. "You're up early." I returned the smile. "Yeah, needed some time to think." She hummed, taking a sip of her coffee before settling into the chair across from me. "About the papers?" I nodded, watching her closely. "Yeah." I gave them a long, hard look. I saw it, the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She thought she had me, thought I was going to roll over and accept whatever terms she had set. So I leaned forward and slid a thick envelope across the table. Her brows furrowed. "What's this?" I gestured toward it. "Just some paperwork of my own." I figured, since we're talking about being fair, you should take a look. She hesitated. That wasn't part of the script she had in her head. But curiosity won out, and she pulled the papers free. I watched as her lips parted, her eyes scanning the words. The way her face shifted from confidence to confusion, then to something almost like fear. Because this wasn't the agreement she had drawn up. This was something else entirely. She flipped through, faster now, and I could practically see her mind racing. My terms were simple. She walked away with nothing. No stake in my business. No spousal support. No claim to the house. Her breath hitched when she reached the last few pages. The evidence. The carefully documented proof that her plans hadn't been so private after all. Conversations, messages, confirmations from people who had heard her say, in no uncertain terms, that she had been planning to drain me dry the moment my business took off. Her head snapped up. "What is this?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "It's exactly what it looks like." She swallowed. You can't be serious." I set my mug down. "I'm completely serious, Celeste." I leaned back, folding my arms. "You thought you were playing me? That I'd just sign whatever you put in front of me like an idiot?" I tilted my head. "But tell me, who's the idiot now?" Her hand clenched around the pages. You can't do this." "Oh, I can." And I did. She shook her head, trying to compose herself. "This won't hold up." A judge would love to see this," I interrupted, tapping the papers. "And if you try to fight me, I'll make sure this all comes out. Every little scheme, every lie." She was pale now, her perfect, carefully crafted world unraveling right in front of her. I could see her working through her options. She could fight, drag this out, try to weasel her way into something. Or she could take the only out I was giving her. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Sign the papers, Celeste." For a long moment, Celeste just stared at the papers, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the edges. I could see the storm behind her eyes, the battle between pride and reality. She had thought she had me cornered, but now the tables had turned, and she had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. I sat there, calm, knowing this was the moment of truth. She had spent years planning my downfall, but in the end, it was her own greed that would be her undoing. Finally, she exhaled, a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. You think you've won, don't you? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The evidence I had was undeniable. The proof I had gathered over the last few months, the phone calls, the messages, the conversations, all of it was in those papers. If she tried to fight me, it would all come to light. She would be the one exposed as the manipulative, deceitful person she had been all along. She dropped her gaze to the papers in front of her, her fingers hovering over the pages as if she were deciding whether to tear them up or sign them. I could tell she was struggling. I could see the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. Her lips were pressed tight, and her jaw clenched, but she wasn't as composed as she had been earlier. Her mask was cracking, and I wasn't going to be the one to put it back together for her. I never wanted it to be like this, she whispered, her voice shaky, almost apologetic. That's when I realized she wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry she got caught. I leaned forward again, my voice steady. Then you should have thought about that before you tried to use me. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and slowly began to sign the papers. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but eventually she completed the task, leaving her signature at the bottom of each page. Once she was done, she pushed the papers back toward me, her eyes now avoiding mine. I glanced over the documents quickly, making sure everything was in order, then folded them and placed them into the envelope. Goodbye, Celeste, I said, my tone soft but final. This is over. She didn't say anything in return. She just stood up slowly, her face pale and expressionless. She looked like someone who had just realized the life they had built was collapsing, piece by piece. I didn't care how she felt anymore. Not after everything. As she walked past me toward the door, she paused. Her voice was almost too quiet to hear. You'll regret this. I shook my head. No, I won't. I already made my peace with it. And with that, she left. The silence that followed was almost comforting. The weight that had been hanging over me for so long was finally gone. Celeste's plans had crumbled. Her mask of charm and manipulation had fallen apart. And now, all that was left was the wreckage of a marriage that had never really been real. I stood up, looking around the house, the one I had worked so hard for, the one she thought she could take from me. It was still mine. Everything was still mine. And as much as I had thought I'd be sad or even angry when it came to this moment, I wasn't. I was relieved. The business, the house, the life I had built, it was all intact. And now it was mine to keep, without any more lies or schemes. So here's where I'm at right now. I've gone through the divorce, and Celeste has signed everything. I'm legally free, and I kept everything, my business, the house, all of it. She thought she had it all figured out, but I had my own plan and made sure I was protected. I didn't confront her directly about the notebook, just let things unfold. I'll admit, I'm feeling pretty good about how it turned out. I don't feel guilty about it because I know she tried to manipulate me for years. But part of me wonders if I went too far with all the evidence I gathered. I could have just accepted the divorce and moved on, but I couldn't let her get away with everything she'd planned. I'm also worried about how people will see me. Maybe I'm not the good guy here, even though I'm the one who was wronged. Was I an a-hole for playing her game? Or was it just karma catching up to her? Would love to hear some opinions. Am I in the right? Or did I take it too far? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe for more amazing content. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Hi everyone, my name's Brandon, and I need to get this off my chest because I still can't believe how things went down at the family reunion last weekend. I don't expect sympathy. I just want to share the story because it's been eating at me for years. So, a little context first. I'm 29, and my older sister, Kasha, has always been the golden child of the family, though my parents never exactly used that term. From the moment she graduated high school, she seemed to get everything handed to her. College paid for, internships arranged, job opportunities one only heard about in passing. Meanwhile, I worked a full-time job after college, saved every penny, and had to fight for every opportunity one got. Growing up, it was subtle at first. Birthday presents were always bigger for her. My parents would brag about her achievements constantly, and even when I did something worth noticing, it was always undercut with, well, Kasia did that last year. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I'd realized that no matter what I did, she'd always be the favored one in their eyes. This past weekend, we had a family reunion at my parents' house, a sprawling place in a nice part of town that I had honestly been saving up for years to afford myself one day. As soon as I walked in, I noticed how everyone was already fawning over Kasia. She was telling stories about her latest promotion, how she'd just got back from a business trip that sounded more like a luxury vacation, and how lucky she was that things just seemed to fall into her lap. At first, I tried to ignore it, focusing on small talk with cousins and distant relatives. But Kasia wasn't subtle about it. She leaned back in her chair, glass of sparkling water in hand, and said with a smirk, "I just don't know why everything works out for me. Some people have all the luck, and some don't. Poor Brandon, always working so hard, but never getting ahead like me." The words stung, but I kept my face neutral. My parents, of course, laughed along, nodding like they agreed. I wanted to say something, but I held back. There's a lot more satisfaction in timing, I've learned. The dinner went on, and the tension built slowly. Kasia started talking about her latest plans. She casually mentioned she'd been eyeing the old family house that had been in my parents' name for years. She said she'd hoped to buy it someday, and my parents immediately started talking about how perfect it would be for her, how she could host events there, and how it's always been her dream. Every word was like a needle in my side, and I felt something in me snap, but in a very calm, controlled way. When dessert came around, everyone was still buzzing about Kasia and her luck. That's when I decided to speak. I cleared my throat and casually said, "Actually, I wanted to share something about the house." The room went quiet immediately. Kasia gave me a teasing smile, clearly expecting some small joke or a tease, but I just kept going. "I closed on it last month," I said, keeping my tone calm. "The house my parents have always talked about selling? It's mine now." For a few seconds, there was this stunned silence, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My parents' faces went pale, Kasia froze mid-smile, and even my cousins didn't know what to say. The whole family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could see the shock, the anger, and, honestly, a little fear flicker across their faces. Kasia opened her mouth like she wanted to yell, to argue, to call me crazy, but I just sat back, calm, watching her scramble for words. The silence in the room was thick enough to taste. For a moment, nobody moved. My parents' faces were a mix of disbelief and thinly veiled panic, and Kasia's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She blinked at me like she'd just seen a ghost, and I had to resist the urge to smile, purely out of satisfaction, not malice, though I admit it felt good. My mom was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly despite her best effort to sound firm. "Brandon, what do you mean you bought it?" I took a slow sip of water before answering, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I mean exactly what I said. I've had my eye on it for years, saved up, and finally made an offer. It closed last month." Kasia's lips parted, and she let out a short, sharp laugh, more of a nervous sound than genuine amusement. "You what? That's impossible. Mom, Dad, did he really?" My parents exchanged quick glances, their expressions a mix of shame and anger. My dad cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain some control. "Well, we hadn't finalized anything for her yet. It was supposed to be her first choice." "Brandon, we weren't supposed to be her first choice?" I interrupted, keeping my voice level, almost serene. "I don't recall anyone putting it in writing. From what I can tell, it was just talked about, dreamed about. But legally, it's mine now." The way my words hung in the air, the room felt colder. My cousin Mira, who had always subtly sided with Kasia, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Even she couldn't hide her surprise this time. Kasia's face turned red, a mix of fury and embarrassment. "This isn't fair. You don't get it handed to you like that." I let the statement sit for a beat. "Funny thing," I said slowly. "I've been waiting my whole life for something to be handed to me. But you know what? That never happened. So I worked for it. I saved for it. I did it myself." She opened her mouth again, probably to argue, but this time my dad cut in. His voice was low, tense, but trying to maintain authority. "Brandon, you shouldn't be flaunting this. Kasia, she's always had her sights on that property. It would have made things simpler. Simpler. I repeated. Simpler for whom? Certainly not me. For years, I've watched her get praise for things I worked just as hard for. For years, I've watched her get opportunities, financial help, recognition. And now you're telling me it would have been simpler if I just stepped aside? That's rich. The words seemed to sting more than I expected. My mom clutched her hands in front of her mouth, blinking rapidly. Kasia was pale, but her fury was starting to bubble over, the kind that can't be stopped by logic or reason. You can't just take everything from me. This was mine. It's my turn for once. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but steady, almost like a teacher correcting a student. Kasia, this isn't about taking. This is about finally getting something I earned. Something I fought for. You've had everything handed to you for so long. You've forgotten what it means to work for it. I didn't take it from you. I took it for myself. The air in the room shifted again. Some of the younger cousins, who had been quietly watching, whispered among themselves, looking at their parents for guidance. But my parents didn't say much. They were frozen, caught between loyalty to Kasia and the undeniable fact that I was in the right. Kasia's voice rose, and suddenly, she was pacing in the living room, hands flailing. This is ridiculous. How did you even get the money? You're still at the same job. You couldn't possibly have. I held up a hand, not out of politeness, but to pause the chaos. I told you I saved. Every penny, every bonus, every side job I could take. I made sacrifices I didn't have to brag about because no one was watching. No one handed me anything. You, on the other hand, have had everything on a silver platter since the day you were born. Kasia stopped pacing for a moment, her chest heaving. You're ruining everything. Mom, Dad, do something. My mom's eyes filled with a mix of frustration and panic, like she was seeing the daughter she favored unravel in front of her. My dad ran a hand through his hair, muttering, We didn't think he'd do it before her. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. Not gloating, exactly, but it was satisfying to watch the power dynamic finally shift, even if just slightly. Kasia was still sputtering, trying to find the words to fight back, but there weren't any that could undo what was already done. And then came the moment that made the room almost unbearable. Kasia, in a last-ditch effort to reassert her control, stormed up to my parents and whispered something sharply. I couldn't hear the words exactly, but their faces went from panic to outright horror. Mira gasped, covering her mouth. My mom's eyes widened, my dad's jaw tightened. I didn't know what she said, but whatever it was clear she had just thrown a new, dangerous twist into the mix. I could feel the tension spike even higher, like a rope pulled to the breaking point. Then, Kasia turned back toward me, her eyes blazing, her voice shaking with fury. You think this is over, Brandon? You haven't seen anything yet. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. And that's when I realized the next chapter of this confrontation wasn't just about the house. Kasia was planning a move that could make my victory short-lived, and my parents weren't going to stop her. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't stunned awe. It was fear. Everyone could feel the storm about to hit. I sat there, calm, letting it all hang in the air. Because I knew one thing for certain. She had underestimated me, just like she always did. The message on my phone made my stomach tighten. I hadn't even realized I'd unlocked it during the tense silence. It was from an unknown number, but the name attached was unmistakable, Kasia. The message itself was brief, almost innocuous on the surface, but the undertone was sharp, threatening. You think you've won? We'll see about that. Don't think this is the end, Brandon. I'm just getting started. I read it once, twice, then set the phone down on the table, deliberately letting it be visible. My family noticed immediately. Kasia's lips twitched, like she was trying to hide satisfaction at my visible reaction, but it didn't work. My parents looked between the two of us, panic creeping in again. Mira, my cousin, gave me a worried glance, like she wasn't sure which side to take. Or maybe she was terrified of what Kasia might do next. Kasia, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, smirking slightly, trying to regain the composure she always wore like armor. See? Even now, I'm ahead of you. You think a house and some savings make you untouchable? I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm but steady, and said, Kasia, I'm not worried. I worked for what I have. You've been given things your entire life. and yet you act like the world owes you more. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Brandon, you don't get it. I have ways. Ways that you can't even imagine. That house. That's just the beginning. You think buying it yourself changes anything? You're in my world now, and I don't lose. My parents exchanged another glance, the kind that says, we should have stopped this a long time ago, but it was too late. Whatever storm Kasia was about to unleash was beyond their control. My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. No, let her speak. I want to hear it, I said, keeping my voice calm, almost neutral, but inside I was alert, bracing for the next move. Kasia's smirk returned, though there was a glint of something darker in her eyes. You think I'm just going to sit here and let you take the family's legacy from me? That house was meant to be mine. Everything I've worked toward, every plan I've made. It doesn't just vanish because you finally decided to play the adult. I know things you don't, Brandon. Secrets. Connections. And I can use them. All of them. Against you. The air grew heavier, and I noticed even the cousins who had been chatting quietly at the side were now frozen, watching the exchange. Myra's hand hovered near her mouth, her eyes wide, and I could tell she was wondering whether Kasia might actually go too far. I leaned back slightly, trying to project calm and control, because panic would only give her the upper hand. Kasia, go ahead. Use your connections, spill your secrets, whatever you think will hurt me. It won't work. You've underestimated what I've been capable of all these years. Her expression faltered for just a moment. I caught it, a flicker of uncertainty, but it was quickly replaced by anger. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, making everyone flinch. You don't understand. You have no idea what I'm capable of. And when I'm done, you won't have anything. Not the house, not respect, not anything. You'll regret ever thinking you could step into my world. I could see my parents shift uneasily in their seats. My dad muttered under his breath. We didn't know she'd go this far. My mom's hands were shaking slightly, the first real sign I'd ever seen that they were scared of her. And in that moment, I realized something. Kasia had always been the puppet master, manipulating everyone around her. And now that she felt threatened, she was ready to pull every string she could find. Then she did something that made my stomach drop. Kasia pulled out her phone and started typing furiously, muttering to herself. I couldn't see the screen, but I could feel the shift in the room. The cousins exchanged worried glances. Even my parents seemed frozen in fear, like they were waiting for some unspeakable revelation. After what felt like an eternity, Kasia looked up, her eyes scanning the room. You'll see. Everyone will see. By tomorrow, this reunion, this family, it won't feel the same. And Brandon, you'll realize just how small your victory really is. A cold silence followed. Nobody dared speak. Mira was the first to break eye contact with her entirely, shifting uncomfortably. My parents' expressions were unreadable, a mix of shame, fear, and something else, regret, perhaps, for having favored Kasia for so long. I remained calm on the surface, but inside I was calculating. I had spent years planning, saving, and thinking strategically. I knew Kasia's arrogance would make her overconfident. But now, it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about her ego. This was about power, about control. And she wasn't afraid to drag the entire family into it to get what she wanted. Then my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, and my heart skipped a beat. Another message. This time, it wasn't from Kasia directly. It was from someone I didn't recognize, but the content made the blood drain from my face. We've been watching. She's planning something bigger than you think. Be careful. I looked up, and suddenly, the family room didn't feel like it had walls. It felt like a cage. Kasia was still smirking, oblivious to the fact that she'd just made a mistake revealing that she had people watching her moves. Or maybe she didn't care. But now I knew this had escalated far beyond a simple rivalry over a house. The tension was palpable. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting to see how I would respond. Kasia's threat had hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I realized that whatever I did next would determine not just my victory over her, but how this entire family would survive the fallout. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I forced myself to remain calm. I knew the next move would define everything. And as I sat there, phone in hand, I understood something crucial. Kasia had just stepped into a game she couldn't fully control, and neither could my parents. The air never really settled after that night. Kasha's little threat, veiled, smug, meant to scare, had the exact opposite effect on me. For the first time in my life, I felt less like the sidelined kid and more like someone who had finally figured out the rules of the game. I could have responded in the moment with a speech, with a triumphant gloat, with something to puncture her ego and leave her gasping. Instead, I did what I always did when stakes mattered. I let the moment sit. I let people stew in it, and I started moving in silence. That week was an exercise in patience. Kasha broadcasted the usual venom on social media. Photos of her in expensive places, comments about new adventures, and how life rewarded the bold. She texted my parents several times a day, alternating between false charm and thinly veiled panic. My mom answered her every time. My dad pretended not to notice. I let them all think I was rattled. I wasn't. I was planning. First, information. I needed to know what Kasha actually had, the scope of her connections, the leverage she claimed to possess. So I called the one person nobody expected me to call, Mira. She'd always been on Kasha's side socially, but she'd never been cruel. When I asked her to meet for coffee, she came with an apologetic look and a nervous laugh, as if she'd been waiting to be dragged into a family war and finally had a reason to speak her mind. "What are you doing, Brandon?" she asked, stirring her cappuccino like it might make this less real. Kasha wasn't joking. She has people. People who can make things difficult. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm trying to map what difficult looks like. Who are these people? What's their angle? What's the worst thing she could do?" I watched her eyes for tells. Mira had always been tactile. Her face gave away more than her words. "She's been cozying up to people in real estate for years," Mira admitted, voice low. "And there was that time 2 summers ago when she was meeting with someone at the country club, booked out, said it was about investments. No one knew who he was. She's also been friendly with a woman from the bank, Lauren, who handles loans for local properties. And there's talk she's been whispering about some old debts my uncle had. If she drags up some financial skeleton, she might try to freeze things." It was the exact sort of thing I needed. Not because I was afraid, though I was sensible, but because revenge without an understanding of the battlefield is reckless. Revenge properly executed is a correction, not an act of wild vindictiveness. Second, allies. Mira surprised me in ways she hadn't before. After that coffee, she started passing along small, careful pieces of information. Texts Kasha had sent in confidence, an email chain where Kasha flattered a realtor with a promise of long-term partnership, even a voicemail where Kasha muttered about nosing around the title when she thought no one else was listening. None of it was explosive on its own, but together it sketched a picture. Kasha had been quietly cultivating influence around the family property for years. She tried to convert goodwill into paperwork. Third, control. I tightened things up on my end. I had the house inspected the weekend after the reunion. Nothing dramatic. I was protecting an asset, not staging a takeover. I changed 2 locks and had a simple alarm system installed. Not because I was paranoid, but because people who feel entitled often try to reclaim what they think is rightfully theirs the first second they're denied. I told my real estate agent to forward any inquiries to me directly and to freeze any negotiation until she talked to me first. When I did this, the agent, an obliging, efficient woman named Tamsin, admitted, offhand, that Kasha had called her a few weeks ago, vague about intention, but very clear the house was in the family fold and that there should be a way to make this work. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a hardline focus I'd never had before. I wrote down everything Kasha could possibly do to undermine me: title challenges, trumped-up liens, emotional manipulation that could lead to blackmail, and then I checked off ways to counter each move. Some of it was practical: proper documentation, escrow, a short note from my bank confirming my mortgage terms. Some of it was psychological: a quiet, persistent narrative that I was the one who had worked, saved, and earned this, told to the right ears in the right tone. People believe a story if it's told calmly and repeatedly. They distrust those who shout. The first real strike came a week later. Kasha emailed my parents at dawn, an urgent message about an old family debt that had allegedly been overlooked in estate planning. She suggested they might be liable if the property transferred. She attached a mess of documents and a note from a lawyer, carefully generic, ambiguous, designed to terrify. My parents panicked and called me. Their voices were small on the phone, coded in a new, brittle fear. They asked me if I had taken something without telling them, and whether Kasia could do anything. I listened and allowed myself to be conciliatory, all the while filing the documents the moment I hung up. They were a mess of forms and passion, but nothing legally binding. It smelled like a scare tactic. Kasia had probably purchased the form or persuaded someone to draft it in haste. Still, I didn't dismiss it publicly. I had my attorney, one I'd met quietly through a contractor friend, review everything. The attorney wrote a clear, short letter. Everything in order, the transfer valid, the alleged debt either non-existent or irrelevant to the property's title. I printed the letter and handed copies to my parents personally, in person, because public comm is more convincing face-to-face than from a distance. Kasia's next moves were petty and precise. She tried to poison the well socially, sending private messages to mutual friends about how Brandon took advantage of the family. She sent a curated set of photographs to our extended relatives, twisted images that suggested I'd been secretive, shady. People began to murmur. The humiliation was the point. She hoped that social pressure would force me to step back. It didn't. I countered with quiet facts. Photos of me signing closing documents with witnesses, text messages confirming the timeline, Tamsin's email confirming there had been no backdoor deal. Every time she lobbed a rumor, I brought truth, measured, calm, and always in writing. But the weapon that really rattled me was a series of calls to my workplace. HR called one morning. Someone claiming to be a distant relative had left a voicemail alleging impropriety around the purchase. My supervisor called me into his office with a sympathetic look, asking questions that felt like interrogation but were just due diligence. My stomach dropped in a way it hadn't since college exam seasons. Reputation is fragile, and Kasia knew that. Here's where the plan shifted from defense to offense. Kasia had optics and whispers. She had connections that moved rumors. I had patience, witnesses, and, most importantly, documentation. The next phase required a little theater. Not for me, for her. People who believe themselves entitled are often spectacularly performative. They think the loudest lie wins. So I prepared one for her. I set a date. The family dinner where the extended relatives would be in town for a holiday the following month. Not a reunion. She'd tried to weaponize those before, but a smaller, supposedly casual gathering that Kasia would surely show up to flaunt. I invited a few people I trusted, Mira, Tamsin, who agreed to come undercover as a friend, my contractor, and the attorney who'd cleared the title. I told them all to keep cool, to act surprised if Kasia launched her usual performance, and to be ready to produce calm, indisputable proof. I wanted the reveal to be quiet and precise, like a scalpel. No shouting, no spectacle, just the slow tightening of logic until the lies had nowhere left to hide. The day came. The house smelled of roast and lemon polish. My parents were tense in a way that suggested they were torn, shame shadowed with loyalty. Kasia swept in with the practiced ease of someone who never expects to be challenged. She was joking with relatives, trading those little, conversational lies that make the rounds at family tables. I sat at the end of the table, a plate untouched, the guests arranged like chess pieces. Myra's eyes met mine across the room and gave a subtle nod. Tamsin settled into the chair beside my mom, her expression neutral, which was exactly what I wanted. Conversation drifted, as family conversations do, football scores, work gripes, a cousin's new baby, until Kasia steered it, as always, to her triumphs. She spoke about a charity gala she'd planned, the network she'd cultivated, the kindness she'd shown by suggesting the house be hers. She laughed, and a few relatives laughed with her, partly out of habit, partly out of fear. That was my opening. I could feel everyone's attention shift as I set down my fork and spoke in a calm voice that cut through the ambient noise. Before dessert, I said, there's something I want everyone to see. I reached into my jacket and set 3 things on the table in front of me. A printed copy of the title, the letter from my attorney, and a short legal summary Tamsin had prepared confirming the timeline of offers and communications. Kasia's smile faltered. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but the room reacted. Heads turned. The air tightened. For a second, I felt like the whole world was holding its breath. She recovered first with a laugh that had no mirth in it. Really, Brandon? We're doing this here, she asked, trying to make it a joke. But her voice wavered. I met her gaze directly. Really? I said. And if you have anything to add, anything at all, I'd like to hear it now. Her face hardened. There was a long, slow silence before she opened her mouth. You think papers and lawyers make you a better person? They don't change the fact you stole something that should have been ours, she said, pacing the line between accusation and breakdown. That's when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't look at it, but the room was already cranked to a voltage I couldn't ignore. I glanced down and saw an unknown number with a short message preview that made my stomach drop. Photographs. Then the sender name, Kasia. I watched Kasia's jaw clench as she saw me looking at my screen. She smiled then, sharp, triumphant, and reached for her purse like someone about to present a final, fatal piece of evidence. Only I beat her to it. I stood, my voice low and steady. Before you do anything, Kasia, there's one thing you should know. I hit play on a small recording I'd made 3 days earlier, the voicemail she'd left for my dad, the one where she whispered about old debts and finding a way, and where her tone slipped from charming to venomous for a heartbeat. The voice was clear, the words were damning. I had it transcribed. I slid the transcript across the table to my dad, to my mom, to the relatives with furrowed brows. Her hand froze mid-reach. The smile vanished. The photograph she'd planned to brandish like a dagger hovered uselessly in her grasp. It was the kind of small, precise move that changes a conversation from hearsay to fact. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. But the look on Kasia's face, betrayal, rage, and finally, the cold panic of someone who realizes they've been outmaneuvered, was worth all the quiet work. She inhaled sharply, the kind of breath a person takes before they throw a punch. Then she said, very quietly, "You're playing a dangerous game, Brandon." I met her without flinch. "So are you." The knock at the door cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone at the table froze. Kasia's eyes darted toward the sound, then back to me, and I could see the panic simmering beneath her carefully constructed veneer. My parents looked almost apologetic, like they had finally realized the consequences of enabling her for decades. Mira remained calm, but I could see the tension in her jaw. I stood and walked to the door, holding myself steady. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a dark suit holding a briefcase. He nodded politely to me as I opened the door. "Brandon Sanders?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Caldwell, an auditor with the county. I have some documents here for verification regarding the Sanders family property, and I was told to deliver them personally." Kasia stiffened, and my parents flinched. I recognized immediately what this was. The formalities confirming that the property transfer was beyond challenge, that no prior claims could interfere, that all the contingencies she had hoped to exploit were legally null. I invited Thomas in, and he began methodically presenting the documents. Kasia hovered behind him, trying to read the papers over his shoulder. My parents muttered under their breath, clearly realizing they were witnessing the moment when all their favoritism and scheming could no longer shield Kasia. Thomas looked at me directly and said, "Everything has been verified. The transfer of 1124 Evergreen Lane is final, complete, and uncontested. There are no liens, no claims, no outstanding debts that could affect this property. Any prior verbal agreements, intentions, or hopes your family had are legally irrelevant." Kasia's jaw dropped slightly. She opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas raised a hand politely. "I'm afraid the law doesn't entertain wishes. The property is now yours, Mr. Sanders." I thanked him calmly and guided him out, closing the door behind him. As soon as the click of the lock echoed, the room felt like it exhaled, though the atmosphere was still thick with tension. Kasia sank into a chair, shoulders slumped, no words coming. She looked like a hurricane that had run out of wind. I turned back to the table, addressing my parents first. "You both should understand something," I said. "This isn't about punishment. This is about accountability. For years, Kasia has been rewarded for everything she wanted, regardless of effort, and you both encouraged it. I've worked my whole life to get what I earned. The difference now is that everyone can see the result." My mom opened her mouth, but I cut her off. "No explanations. No apologies. You enabled her behavior, and now you're seeing the consequences. That's it." Kasia finally looked up at me, eyes red from suppressed frustration. "You think this changes anything, Brandon?" she hissed. I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "No, it changes everything. And you're finally going to learn that life doesn't owe you a thing, not even family." Your luck ran out the day you underestimated me. Her fury was palpable, but at that point, it was impotent. The room had shifted completely. My relatives whispered among themselves, some with confusion, others with a grudging respect for what I had done. Mira gave me a small, proud nod, and even my parents couldn't argue. They had seen the legal confirmation, the documented proof, and my calm, strategic handling of every one of Kasha's moves. Over the next few days, Kasha tried to salvage some semblance of control. She sent messages, attempted phone calls, and even tried to appeal to mutual friends, but everyone had seen the evidence. Her words no longer carried weight. My parents, embarrassed and shaken, stopped taking her calls immediately, realizing that siding with her now only reflected badly on them. I continued to live in the house I had worked for, making improvements quietly and steadily, while Kasha floundered. Her social influence evaporated. Friends who had tolerated her arrogance began to drift away, unimpressed with her petty manipulations and constant threats. The few relatives who had cheered her on now saw her true nature, a pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and cruelty. Months later, my life had settled into a peaceful rhythm I hadn't known was possible. The house was mine in every sense, fully documented, fully secure. Kasha, meanwhile, was effectively cut off. She had burned bridges with almost every relative who had once supported her, and my parents' relationship with her was strained to the point of near estrangement. Every attempt she made to regain influence or access to the house ended in failure. I didn't gloat publicly, and I didn't need to. The knowledge that I had outmaneuvered a lifetime of entitlement was enough. Kasha's downfall wasn't spectacular, but it was absolute. The family dynamics had shifted. For the first time, my parents could no longer ignore the reality of who I was and what I could achieve, and they finally recognized that their favoritism had created more problems than it had solved. And as for Kasha, she remained a cautionary tale within the family, someone whose entitlement, arrogance, and manipulations had finally caught up with her. I never spoke to her again beyond necessary formalities, and I ensured the house remained legally untouchable. Every move she made to challenge me failed, and eventually, even the threats stopped coming. In the end, I got what I had worked for. I finally had a place I could call my own, free of favoritism, free of manipulation. My parents, once blind to the inequality in their household, were left to confront the consequences of their choices. And Kasha, well, she had nothing left but her own ego and the knowledge that for once, she wasn't the one in control. I didn't forgive them. I didn't pretend to. They had been villains in my story for as long as I could remember, and I allowed them to see the results of their favoritism and manipulation firsthand. Justice, in my view, didn't require malice. It required patience, strategy, and resolve. And after years of being sidelined, I finally had all three. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. I still remember the exact moment the shift began, the moment the air in the room changed, the moment my mom's voice became something sharp instead of soft. I was 32, sitting at the dining table with my elbows propped up, half listening to my mom explain her final wishes while poking at a slice of lemon cake she'd baked for the occasion. A family meeting, she called it. Very serious, very formal. And yet she served cake. I should have known something was off when she asked all of us to sit down after dinner like we were a board of directors instead of a family. My name's Craig, and I'm the youngest son. Still am, I guess. That night just made it obvious that I was also the least favored, even if no one said it out loud. Not until then. My brother, Daniel, is 4 years older than me and has always been the golden child. It wasn't even subtle. Growing up, he got the new bikes, the weekend trips, the expensive tutoring. I got hand-me-downs, leftover affection, and the "you're so independent" pep talks whenever I tried to ask for anything similar. My parents split when I was 10. Mom got custody. Dad moved out and across town, not far, but emotionally it felt like he'd gone to Mars. He always tried to stay involved, but the guilt made him more of a background character than a co-parent. He showed up for birthdays, occasionally helped with school projects, and later, when I hit my 20s, we reconnected over coffee and taxes and life advice. Quietly, always quietly. Daniel, meanwhile, played the part of the perfect son so well it might as well have been written for him. Ivy League business school, paid for, of course. A lavish wedding 3 years ago where I wasn't even asked to be the best man. A job Dad got him through an old friend, and when that didn't pan out, Mom bailed him out with a condo she happened to be holding on to. Nobody ever called it favoritism. They called it support. They called me self-sufficient. They said I didn't need as much help. I never really argued with it out loud. On paper, they weren't entirely wrong. I'd put myself through school on scholarships and late-night delivery shifts. I started a small graphic design company in my 20s and, after years of grinding and sleepless nights, turned it into a full-scale branding agency with actual employees and contracts. I own a modest but clean place, drive a 10-year-old car, and haven't asked them for a dime since I was 18. But success doesn't erase the sting of being overlooked. If anything, it just makes it easier for people to justify ignoring you. So when Mom sat us down that night and said, "Now that your father and I are getting older, we've decided it's time to make things clear about the future," I already had a bad feeling in my stomach. She had her lawyer's folder in one hand, her reading glasses in the other. I looked over at Dad, who was unusually quiet, his jaw clenched like he was trying not to say something. Daniel leaned back, confident, one arm draped over the back of his chair like he owned the place. Which, apparently, he soon would. Mom went on, explaining how they'd been restructuring the estate, how they wanted to avoid confusion later, and how they thought it was best to be transparent with us. "We've decided Daniel will inherit the house, the lake property, and the family trust," she said, like she was announcing tomorrow's weather. "Craig, you've done very well for yourself. You're thriving. You're independent. We don't worry about you. So this just makes the most sense." I didn't even blink. I just nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I'd gotten used to this. The rationalizations. The passive compliments that were really just excuses not to treat me equally. I stared at the cake, watching the frosting melt into the plate under the heat of the chandelier. No one said anything for a second. Daniel smiled, trying to look humble but failing. Mom looked at me like she expected a reaction. Dad kept staring at the table, and for a moment, I thought I saw shame flash across his face. The thing is, a few weeks before that meeting, I had shown Dad something. Something big. Something that would have changed everything if anyone else had seen it. But I'd asked him to keep it between us, at least for the time being. And he had. Until that moment. Later that night, after everyone had gone their separate ways, Daniel back to his condo, Mom to her garden tea on the porch, Dad found me in the hallway near the coat closet. His voice was low. His eyes were heavy. "Please," he whispered, "tell them what you showed me. I think it's time." I hesitated. I could feel the weight of everything pressing in on me. Years of being second. Years of swallowing things just to keep the peace. But when I walked back into that dining room and pulled out the folder from my bag, the same one I had once shyly handed to Dad over coffee, the room fell quiet. My brother's smile vanished first. Mom's face went pale next. Dad stood beside me, not saying a word, but his presence said enough. I flipped open the folder and laid the documents out on the table. No one moved at first. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the fridge and the whisper of the pages as I spread them slowly across the table like playing cards in a high-stakes poker game. I could feel their eyes on me, flickering between confusion and growing tension, like they weren't sure if I was bluffing or holding something nuclear. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dipping into that smug tone he always used when he thought he was still in control. Like he already believed he'd won, and this was just a formality. A little show for attention. He was half laughing, eyes scanning the first sheet. "Craig, come on. We don't need to drag. Shut up and read," Dad cut in. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. But it was the kind of voice that stopped people mid-breath. Even I looked at him. I hadn't heard Dad speak like that since I was a teenager, and he caught Daniel trying to frame me for breaking the garage window. Mom adjusted her glasses, leaned in, and finally picked up the first document, a signed valuation report, then a partnership contract, then a notarized letter from a corporate lawyer. I didn't say anything. I just let them read. 3 weeks earlier, I'd finalized something big, something that had been quietly years in the making. I'd negotiated a merger between my branding agency and one of the fastest-growing digital marketing firms on the East Coast. The deal not only gave me a significant equity stake, but the resulting company had been valued at just over $25 million. Dad was the only one I'd told. I didn't want to parade it around like some sort of flex. That's never been me. But I showed him the paperwork because I wanted him to understand that I wasn't just doing fine. I had built something. Something real. Something I never once asked them to help me with. And now, faced with these papers, with the truth spelled out in clean fonts and legal signatures, Mom went still. Her fingers stopped mid-page. Daniel's smirk was gone entirely. "What is this supposed to mean?" he finally asked. But this time his voice cracked. Just slightly. The kind of crack that happens when you realize, too late, that the ground you were standing on wasn't solid. "I showed this to Dad weeks ago," I said, my voice steady. He knew, and I asked him not to say anything until I was ready. I didn't want to throw it in anyone's face. "Then why now?" Mom snapped. Her voice was sharper than I expected. Not hurt. Not even embarrassed. Defensive. "Why humiliate us like this in our own home?" I blinked. "Humiliate? You just sat me down and told me my brother gets everything because I'm doing fine. You tried to justify cutting me out of the family trust like it was common sense. You've done it all my life. And now that I show you something concrete, I'm the one being unfair." Daniel stood up, looking more rattled now. "You think money makes you better than us?" "No," I said, "but it apparently made you better than me for the last 20 years. And I never said a word. That was when things truly started to unravel. The days that followed were tense. We didn't speak much after that night. Not even when we bumped into each other during a family barbecue. Mom insisted on keeping on the calendar for appearances. The quiet was worse than yelling. It was cold, measured, like they were regrouping, strategizing. I thought that would be the end of it, the awkward reveal, the emotional gut punch, the dramatic scene. I assumed, wrongly, that now that the truth was out, we'd settle into a new normal. Not close, not friendly, but honest. I underestimated them. A week later, I got a call from my bank. A flagged attempt to access one of my business accounts. Then another call, this time from a leasing office I'd worked with on a branding campaign. They were suddenly rescinding our contract, citing reputational concerns linked to rumors about my company's funding. And then the worst one, an anonymous tip to the IRS suggesting I'd falsified portions of my merger valuation. My hands went numb as I sat there in my apartment, piecing it together. I didn't have proof yet, but I had a pretty solid hunch where this was coming from. Daniel knew people in finance. He'd worked at 2 firms, both of which had ties to the local startup scene. And Mom had spent her life building connections through the country club and PDA networks that could reach into any number of businesses or organizations. They hadn't just dismissed me. They were trying to break me. I met Dad for coffee the next morning. We sat in the corner booth of a diner we used to go to when I was in high school. He didn't even touch his cup, just looked at me like he already knew what I was going to say. "I need to ask," I said. "Did you tell them anything I told you in confidence?" He shook his head, quick and firm. "No. I swear to you, Craig. Not a word." I nodded slowly. "Then it's them. They're retaliating." He exhaled hard. "I thought this might happen. That's why I made copies." I looked up. Copies. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather folder, not unlike the one I'd used at the dinner. Inside were duplicates of everything I'd shown him. And more. Screenshots of messages Daniel had sent him over the years, filled with arrogant boasts and casual contempt. Notes Mom had written, including one particularly rough one that said, in her handwriting, "Don't give Craig too much. He'll just waste it trying to prove himself." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mouth had gone dry. That wasn't even the worst of it. Because 2 days after that, I got a knock at my office door. My assistant let me know someone had stopped by. A woman, early 30s, wearing a beige coat and holding a baby on her hip. She asked for me by name. Said it was important. I walked out front and froze the second I saw her face. "Hi," she said quietly. "You don't know me, but I know your brother." I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Her eyes flicked down. "My name is Lindsay. Daniel and I dated for almost 3 years. We had a son together. He told me he'd handle everything, that your family would help. But then he ghosted us. Said he couldn't be seen with me. Said it would complicate his legacy." I stared at her. She opened her bag and pulled out documents, paternity results, texts, even a letter from a lawyer Daniel had paid to offer her hush money in exchange for signing a waiver of child support. I took it all. I didn't even know what I was going to do with it yet, but I took it. When she left, I sat back in my chair, surrounded by the weight of everything. My chest tight, my brain reeling, my hands shaking. This wasn't just favoritism. This was character assassination. This was sabotage. This was my own family trying to bury me because I didn't stay in the box they built for me. Because I didn't stay quiet. Because I didn't let them hand Daniel a crown he didn't deserve without a fight. And that was the moment it happened. The breaking point. The quiet, suffocating realization that I could never go back to who I was before that dinner. That this wasn't just about inheritance or business or even resentment. This was war. And I was done playing nice. The first real hit came 3 days after Lindsay showed up at my office. It was a Thursday morning, gray and spitting rain. I was sitting at my desk, half focused on drafting an email to a potential client in Atlanta, when my phone buzzed. Caller ID, my firm's lead counsel, Nina. No greeting, no preamble, just 6 words I'll never forget. Craig, we have a serious problem. I leaned back in my chair, heart already racing. Go on. There's been a leak, she said. Multiple documents tied to the merger, projections, early-stage term sheets, even some internal communications between your team and theirs. Someone forwarded them anonymously to the investor's legal counsel. They're now questioning if you inflated numbers to close the deal. My stomach dropped. I didn't. We were conservative with the projections. You know that. I know, she said. But the optics don't look good. Especially not with the new anonymous tip to the SEC. I didn't even hear the rest. My brain shut off after SEC. By that afternoon, 2 major clients had paused contracts, pending clarification. One PR firm we were courting quietly backed out of a branding project. The new merged board scheduled an emergency session without inviting me, despite my equity stake. In my inbox? A landmine of damage control. I went home that night, kicked off my shoes, and just stood in the kitchen staring at the blank wall above the stove. It felt like my whole body had become static, that numb, white noise feeling when you're too exhausted to be angry but not tired enough to sleep. I didn't tell anyone, not even Dad. Not at first. I didn't want to give my family the satisfaction of knowing their scheme had worked. But it was working. Every day for the next week, it was something else. A whisper campaign about how I manipulated the merger. An anonymous blog post claiming I'd bullied an intern 2 years ago. Complete fabrication, but damaging enough to make a few people side-eye me. A subtle, slow drip erosion of my name. Like rust on metal you can't scrub off. And the worst part? It worked. At least temporarily. 2 weeks later, the board voted to suspend my executive duties, pending further investigation. My lawyer warned me not to make public statements. Nina was doing damage control, but even she looked tired on our Zoom calls. My company, the one I built from scratch in a tiny apartment on a secondhand laptop, was slipping through my fingers. I hit rock bottom on a Wednesday. I remember it exactly. I hadn't eaten more than half a granola bar in 24 hours. I hadn't answered any personal messages, not even from Dad. I was sitting on the edge of my bathtub, still in yesterday's hoodie, watching the sink drip like it was trying to keep time. That's when my phone buzzed again. One new email. Subject, thought you'd like to see this. No sender name, just an address I didn't recognize. I opened it. Attached was a screenshot of a text exchange between Daniel and someone labeled Ruthie, Mom's friend. He was gloating, saying things like, he thought he could just strut in and embarrass us. Now he's learning what real power looks like. And another message, wait until the IRS letter hits. He'll fold. I stared at the screen, a wave of nausea crawling up my throat. But underneath the sickness, there was something else. A spark, a flicker of clarity. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to erase me. That was the night everything changed. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat down and wrote out everything I knew. Every name, every connection, every underhanded trick I suspected. I started pulling receipts, emails, calendar logs, audio memos. I combed through years of files. By dawn, I had a rough timeline, a pattern, and a motive. I made 3 calls that day. First to Dad, who picked up before the second ring. I'm in, I said. I'm not taking this lying down. Second to Lindsay, Daniel's ex, who'd left her number in case I ever needed help. She answered from what sounded like a daycare drop-off line. I told her I believed her. I told her I wanted to help her get justice, too. She didn't hesitate. Third to someone I hadn't talked to in years, Malcolm Nguyen. A data security expert I'd done a small contract for back when I was freelancing. Quiet guy. Sharp. A ghost online, but a wizard with digital forensics. You need a paper trail traced? He asked after I explained. I can do better. Give me access, and I'll show you where the fingerprints are. The next 2 months were slow, methodical, and grueling. While the official investigation into me plodded along, I worked behind the scenes. Quietly, carefully, I cleared my calendar, fired my assistant to avoid leaks, operated from my home office with the blinds shut and the lights low. Malcolm found 3 document modifications on the leaked files, timestamps altered to make them look more recent. One matched the IP address of Daniel's condo complex. Another came from an account tied to Mom's nonprofit. Dad, meanwhile, went digging through the family's financial history, not for my sake, but for his own. After all, the trust had originally been set up jointly, and he wanted to understand how Mom had gotten the lawyer to exclude me without even a discussion. What he found was damning. Somehow, over the years, Mom had been moving small amounts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, from various family investments into a private account. One that had quietly funded Daniel's condo, his failed business venture, and even part of his wedding. She had siphoned nearly $400,000 without telling Dad. He didn't confront her right away. He documented everything, had a third-party accountant verify the transfers, quietly removed his name from all joint accounts. Then he came to me and said, "When the time comes, I'll back you. Fully." But while I was rebuilding from the shadows, life didn't pause. I started therapy again, virtual sessions twice a week. Not because I needed to heal, but because I needed someone to help me make sense of the mess. Someone neutral. Someone who didn't try to convince me to be the bigger person or forgive and forget. And in those sessions, I realized something. I'd spent most of my life trying to earn their love, their approval, their attention. I'd worked myself to the bone not just to succeed, but to prove I was worth something to them. But they were never going to see me. Not really. And I didn't need them to. The realization didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the betrayal or the anger, but it gave me clarity, freedom. And with that freedom came energy, the kind I hadn't felt in years. I started working out again. Not to look good, just to feel strong. I reconnected with a few friends I'd pushed away during the chaos of scaling my business. I even booked a solo trip to Montana for a week, just to get air, space, a view of something that wasn't skyscrapers or spreadsheets. And then something unexpected happened. An investor I'd once pitched to, a venture capitalist named Teresa who'd passed on my merger offer but liked my ethics, reached out. Said she'd heard, through the grapevine, that I was having a rough time. Asked if I wanted to grab lunch. We did. One lunch turned into 2, then 3. Eventually, she asked, "What are you working on now?" I smiled and said, "A comeback." She leaned in. "Tell me more." By the time I left that third lunch, we had a handshake agreement. She'd back me if I wanted to start something new, something independent. She believed in me, not just because of what I'd built before, but because of how I'd handled its collapse. "You took a hit," she said, "and you didn't crumble. Most people would have. That's the kind of founder I bet on." So I began drafting again, not out of spite, not for revenge, for me. By the end of the 3rd month, the dust around the merger had started to settle. The board investigation concluded that while there had been concerns raised, no material fraud or ethical breach could be confirmed. I wasn't reinstated. The damage to my image had already served their purposes, but I kept my equity, which meant 2 things. I still had influence, and I was still in the room. Not that Mom or Daniel knew that. As far as they were concerned, I was a ghost, swept aside, buried by their maneuvering, too proud or broken to push back. And I let them think that. I fed into it. I posted less online. I skipped a few family events. I even sent a polite, detached message to Mom thanking her for the clarity she gave me that night at the dinner table. It was pure theater, and she swallowed it whole. I needed them comfortable. I needed them overconfident. Because I wasn't just planning to hit back. I was planning to make sure they never forgot the sound of it. And I knew exactly where to start. The house. Our family home wasn't just sentimental real estate. It sat on over 2 acres of land in a rapidly gentrifying suburb. When I did the math with Dad's accountant, I realized something staggering. The property alone was worth nearly $2.8 million. More if subdivided. Mom had always spoken of it like it was a crown jewel, passed from one worthy heir to the next. Which, of course, in her mind meant Daniel. But there was a problem with that. It wasn't entirely hers to give. Back when they bought it, my parents had signed a rare joint deed agreement with a survivorship clause. The clause stated that neither party could sell, gift, or bequeath the property to a third party without mutual consent, even post-divorce. unless one of them died. That clause had sat dormant for years, collecting metaphorical dust. Until now. And Mom. She'd forgotten all about it. I didn't remind her. I reminded Dad. You still own half. I told him, sliding the scan clause across the table during a late-night visit to his condo. And she never voided this when she split. If she tries to transfer the title to Daniel without your signature, it triggers a freeze. Dad looked at it like I'd just handed him a loaded revolver. I never wanted it to come to this, he said. I know, I replied. But she made it come to you. He sat back, rubbing his temples. You really think they'd go through with it? That she'd try to sneak it through? I think she already did, I said, opening my laptop. Malcolm had been digging for weeks. With my permission, he'd tracked metadata from property registry API logs. And he found something. A series of draft title transfer documents uploaded and edited from Mom's personal laptop IP address. All dated before that dinner meeting. One even listed Daniel as the sole heir presumptive. She hadn't just made a plan. She'd already acted on it. Dad stared at the screen for a long time. Then he closed it. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, I said. But when I give the signal, I want you to stop the transfer. Cold. Publicly. He nodded. Done. Next, I reached out to Lindsay. Since our first meeting, we'd kept in touch. Not just because we had a common enemy, but because she was sharp. Strategic. After years of being ghosted and sidelined by Daniel, she'd quietly documented everything. Phone calls, bank statements, even a voice memo of him admitting he was too high profile now to deal with custody drama. I want to help you, I told her. But more than that, I want to protect your son. You both deserve more than scraps. I don't want his money, she said. I just want him legally tied. On paper. No more hiding. Then let's do it. Together, we reached out to a family law attorney who specialized in high-conflict cases. I covered the fees, anonymously, through a holding company I'd set up months ago. We filed a paternity claim and, within weeks, received court-ordered DNA results. Daniel didn't even fight it. Probably thought it wouldn't go public. He had no idea what I was preparing. Then came the wild card, Aunt Nadine. She was Mom's younger sister, estranged from the family for over a decade after a bitter inheritance dispute involving their father's fishing cabin. Back then, Mom had convinced everyone Nadine was being greedy. But when I tracked her down through an old contact at a genealogy service, long story, I got the truth. She gutted me, Nadine said on the phone. Lied about our dad's will. Told the lawyer I forged documents. I lost everything. And if you had a chance to speak up again? I asked. I'd shout. Perfect. I invited her to a small charity gala my company was sponsoring. Technically still under the merged firm's name, but I was hosting under my new brand. It wasn't a flashy event, just highbrow enough to attract attention from our local business circles. And yes, I invited my mother. And Daniel. And several of her old bridge club friends who'd bought into the narrative that I was unstable and overreacting. It was bait. And they bit hard. I still remember the look on Mom's face when she walked in and saw me at the entrance, standing beside Aunt Nadine in a sleek navy dress, glass of wine in hand, laughing softly like we were old friends. Her smile faltered. She tried to recover, but her eyes flicked between us like a deer caught in crossfire. Daniel arrived 15 minutes later, oblivious as ever. He walked up, gave me a stiff nod, and started his usual routine, bragging about some startup conference he was invited to, fishing for compliments he thought he'd earned. And then the real show began. One by one, I introduced Aunt Nadine to every person Mom had poisoned against her. I let her tell her side of the story. I nodded thoughtfully, corroborated details where needed, and watched the room slowly shift, the doubt creeping into the eyes of women who'd once echoed every word my mother said like gospel. Later, Daniel pulled me aside near the open bar. What are you doing? He hissed. Hosting a party, I said innocently. What does it look like? You're trying to make her look bad. I'm just giving people the truth. If it looks bad, that's not my fault. His nostrils flared. You're pathetic. And you're a confirmed father who doesn't pay child support, I said, pulling out my phone and showing him the court filing, with his name stamped across the top. He went pale. You wouldn't. Oh, I won't have to, I said. You'll do it yourself. I walked away before he could reply. The final phase of my setup came 2 weeks later, the family meeting. Mom scheduled it. Same house. Same dining room. Same cake, like it was some twisted tradition now. She called it an update meeting. I called it the stage. Daniel looked tired. Not just stressed, haunted. He knew something was coming, but not what. Mom was still trying to keep the upper hand. She smiled as everyone sat, papers neatly stacked beside her. I just want to make sure we're all clear on where things stand, she began. Given everything that's happened, I think we need to move forward with full transparency. That's funny, Dad said, sipping his tea without looking at her. Transparency was never really your thing. She bristled. I beg your pardon. He didn't answer, just set down the cup and looked at me. You ready? I pulled the folder from my bag, a different folder this time. Thicker, heavier. And this time, I wasn't the only one holding one. Lindsay stepped into the room from the hallway, escorted by her attorney. Aunt Nadine arrived 5 minutes later, and Malcolm, in a rare public appearance, walked in holding a tablet loaded with a PowerPoint and timestamps. Mom stood up. What is this? What's going on? I looked at her. At Daniel. At the house I grew up in. The very room where she tried to write me out of everything. This, I said, is the truth. And then I opened the folder. For a moment, all you could hear in the room was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock behind Dad's chair. My mother's mouth hung open slightly, not in shock, but in the sort of stunned disbelief that people get when they realize they've lost control and the rules have changed mid-game. Daniel was staring at Lindsay like she was a ghost from a dream he swore he'd buried. And Dad? He just leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and waited. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. This folder, I said, sliding it slowly toward the center of the table, contains a timeline of every attempt made to sabotage my career. Dates, times, IP addresses, password resets from Daniel's network, a false IRS tip that can be traced to a device in this house, correspondence between Mom and her bridge club, which reads more like a coordinated smear campaign than casual gossip. I paused and looked directly at Daniel. There are screenshots, Dan. Metadata. Malcolm here. I gestured to my friend by the door, verified it all. Your digital fingerprints are all over it. Yours and Mom's. Mom scoffed. Craig, this is ridiculous. You're trying to humiliate us with wild accusations because you couldn't handle a simple estate decision. Right? I said, my voice calm. Let's talk about that decision. Dad reached into his folder and pulled out a crisp, notarized document. The original survivorship deed from when he and Mom bought the house in 1989. You tried to transfer the property to Daniel without my knowledge, he said, turning to her. That's illegal. I've already filed a motion to freeze the title. Mom paled. You wouldn't. I already did, he cut her off. The house is locked in probate now. Nothing can be done with it until both parties agree. And I don't agree. Daniel, looking between us like a cornered animal, blurted out, This is insane. You're all trying to gang up on us. You're ruining this family. No, Lindsay said sharply, stepping forward with her attorney. You did that when you abandoned your son. She set a small photo on the table. A toddler with Daniel's unmistakable eyes, smiling up from a pumpkin patch. Court-ordered paternity confirmed you're the father. You signed a letter offering hush money to avoid legal responsibility. You manipulated me, lied to my face, and when I refused to disappear, you cut off communication. Well, not anymore. We filed for full custody review and child support retroactive to the date of birth. Daniel went rigid. You can't do that. Lindsay's lawyer calmly slid a stack of papers across the table. We already did. Mom stood, trying to take control. All right, enough. Craig, if this is your idea of revenge, you've made your point. What more do you want? An apology? I turned to her. No. I want you to watch as everything you built on lies and favoritism crumbles. I want you to sit in the house you tried to steal from me and realize it's no longer yours to give. I want Daniel to pay for his son, not just financially, but by being forced to be the father he's never had the guts to be. She laughed, bitter, defensive. You think you've won something? You're still alone. Just a bitter little man obsessed with getting even. No, I said, standing now, my voice steady. I'm not alone. And I wasn't. Because over the past 4 months, I'd built something stronger than revenge. I'd built a network. People who'd been wronged. People they stepped on. Employees Daniel had mistreated. Tenants Mom had manipulated through her nonprofit's rental holdings. Friends of mine they'd dismissed, badmouthed, underestimated. They came forward, quietly at first, then louder. I launched a foundation 3 days later. The Grassroots Initiative, named after the idea that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Funded by my own holdings and matched by investors like Teresa, who happily contributed after hearing how I was framed, it was a startup incubator for young entrepreneurs with no family support. People like me, back then. We offered mentorship, seed funding, brand development, and a team of legal advisors who specialized in shielding founders from predatory investors, like Daniel used to be. When the launch made local business news, the article included a single line that sent shockwaves through my family. Founded by Craig Hemsworth, former co-founder of Maven Brand and current majority stakeholder in Emergent Creative Holdings. Because what Mom and Daniel hadn't known was that I never lost control of my company. While I'd been ousted as CEO, I had negotiated my equity stake into a new holding firm. I never left. I simply stepped sideways. And when Teresa and a few other sympathetic board members learned the full truth of the smear campaign, they forced a shareholder vote to reinstate me, not as CEO, but as chairman. Daniel lost every remaining contact he had in our industry within days. And Mom, the fallout was more personal. Dad filed a financial misappropriation claim on the family trust. With evidence from the accountant he'd quietly hired, he froze the remaining assets pending audit. Over $900,000 that Mom had discreetly moved into gifts and unregistered distributions to Daniel over the past 5 years. She claimed it was helping a struggling child. The audit board called it fraudulent misallocation of generational wealth. She lost control of the trust. Her name was removed from its oversight. Dad restructured the payouts into equal 50-50 shares, one to me, one to a custodial account for Daniel's son, to be administered by Lindsay until he turned 18. Mom moved out of the family house 6 weeks later, citing emotional stress. She now lives in a small rental across town. Daniel tried to crash with her, but eventually gave up and moved into a friend's basement. I never celebrated. No champagne. No post gloating online. No, I told you so family text. I just got back to work. Because that's who I've always been. Quiet, steady, relentless. Dad and I are closer than ever. We talk every weekend. He's even started mentoring some of the kids in my foundation. Sometimes I catch him smiling at nothing, like a man who finally, after all these years, said what needed to be said. As for Lindsay, we're not dating, in case you're wondering. But we've become friends. Real ones. Her son's birthday is next month, and she asked if I'd come. I said yes. I bought him a telescope. And every now and then, I pass by the old family house, the lawn trimmed, the porch light still flickering like always. It's empty now. No one wants it. Not anymore. And I smile. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying what they have. It's becoming everything they told you you'd never be, and making sure they have no part in it. Hi everyone, my name's Benjamin, and I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. But sometimes family makes your life feel like a long-running sitcom, except the laughs are mostly at your expense. Growing up, my Aunt Muriel had a way of making every family gathering feel like a competition. She wasn't my mom, but she had a lot of influence over our extended family, and she made sure everyone knew it. Her daughter, Ezra, was her golden girl, smart, polished, and praised for every little achievement. Me? I was the quiet one, the kid who kept to himself and preferred to spend weekends building small projects, tutoring a few neighbors, or just working odd jobs. Nothing glamorous, nothing award-worthy in her eyes. The story I'm about to tell starts at a family dinner last month. I had just returned to my hometown after a year of quietly building a small business. Nothing huge, just a local cafe I'd opened with my own savings. My plan was to stay low-key until the place was established, but apparently, news travels fast among a certain type of people. We were all sitting around the long dining table at Muriel's house. The meal was being served, and as always, Muriel had arranged everything with her signature flair: crystal glasses, polished silverware, the kind of place settings that make you feel like you're under constant inspection. Somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, she turned to me, her eyes narrowing in that familiar, judging way. "Benjamin," she began, voice dripping with that particular mix of sarcasm and superiority she thinks passes for wit. "Why can't you be more like Ezra? She's so successful, so well put together. She actually contributes something meaningful to the family." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd heard this my entire life. How I wasn't good enough. How I didn't measure up. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I took a sip of water, set down my glass carefully, and smiled, deliberately, almost innocently. Funny you mention her, I said, keeping my tone calm. She'll be working for me next week. I watched her fork fall with a clatter onto her plate. The silverware hit hard enough to make the other cousins glance up, startled. What do you mean working for you? Muriel's voice was sharp now, disbelief mixing with a rising panic that I could practically taste. I leaned back, letting a few seconds pass for dramatic effect. I hired her. She'll be helping out at the cafe. I think she could learn a lot from hands-on experience before claiming she's accomplished everything. Her face went pale, like someone had just poured ice water over it. Ezra, sitting next to her, stiffened too. She was the type who thrived on attention, the one who always expected accolades without ever sweating for them. I knew this would hit her harder than any direct insult could. You can't. She's my daughter. Muriel stammered, waving a hand as if that alone could cancel my announcement. She's not. She doesn't need. She's too talented for that kind of work. I kept my smile, calm and collected. Well, everyone starts somewhere, Aunt Muriel. And besides, I figured it's better for her to understand what real effort looks like, rather than relying on everyone else's praise. The room went quiet. Even my other cousins were staring, unsure whether to laugh or intervene. I could feel the tension build like a storm about to break. Muriel's face was slowly turning a deep, almost cartoonish red, her mind racing for some way to save face. I knew at that moment that this wasn't just about Ezra anymore. Muriel had spent years undermining me, mocking my choices, comparing me to her daughter at every opportunity. Now, for the first time, I had the upper hand, and I could see the panic in her eyes like a window opening into a long-hidden truth. She realized she had no control here. She opened her mouth, probably to shout, probably to threaten, but I held up a hand, almost kindly. It's fine, Aunt Muriel. She's a fast learner. I'm sure she'll do fine. The words hung in the air. The clatter of the fork, the silence, the way everyone was holding their breath. It was surreal. For once, I wasn't the kid being judged. I was the one in control. That dinner ended with strained smiles and silent glares, but I knew the fallout wouldn't stop at the table. Muriel would scheme, she would whisper, she would try to reclaim her status in whatever way she thought would hurt me. And Ezra, I knew she was furious, but secretly, she didn't really know how to react yet. After that dinner, I left Muriel's house with a quiet satisfaction that I rarely allowed myself to feel. But it didn't take long for reality to remind me that my family doesn't take things lying down, especially when it comes to anyone challenging their carefully constructed hierarchy. The next morning, I got a message from Ezra. It was short, clipped, and very unlike the cousin who had always been so smugly polite in front of the adults. Benjamin, I don't know if you realize what you just did. This isn't a joke. Working for you? I'm not. I can't. I didn't reply immediately. I wanted her anxiety to settle, for her to stew. Then I wrote back carefully. Ezra, it's not about embarrassment. It's about experience. Everyone has to start somewhere. You'll learn a lot in a week, and after that, you can decide if it's worth continuing. I could almost hear her teeth grinding through the screen as she read that message. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, just a twinge, but the larger part of me savored the poetic justice of it all. For years, she and her mother had looked down on me, sneering at my quiet projects, mocking my small ambitions. Now, the tables had turned. The week passed with a strange tension in the air. Ezra showed up at the cafe on Monday morning dressed impeccably, as if she were expecting a gala rather than a job that required hands-on work. I greeted her with the same calm friendliness I had used at dinner. Morning, Ezra, I said, gesturing toward the small back office. Let's start with some basic inventory and prep work. You'll get the hang of it quickly. Her eyes widened. Inventory? Prep work? Her voice carried that mixture of disbelief and indignation that I knew well. I don't think I'm. You'll do fine, I interrupted softly, almost soothingly. Everyone has to start somewhere. Trust me, it's worth seeing how things run behind the scenes. The day dragged, and I watched her slowly realize that I wasn't exaggerating. There was no shortcut here, no preferential treatment. She had to lift crates of flour, label pastries, and even face a handful of difficult customers who didn't care about her perfectly polished demeanor. Meanwhile, the ripples back home were already starting. Muriel had discovered Ezra's messages to me and was furious. I didn't hear from her directly at first, but her influence was evident in the subtle maneuvers around me. I started noticing it during family events. Whispered comments, cousins giving me side glances, an intentional bump in conversation that somehow always looped back to my failures or lack of direction. Then came the call from my mother. "Benjamin," she began carefully, though I could hear the tension in her voice. "I heard about what you did with Ezra." "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I offered her an opportunity to gain real experience. "Benjamin, she's Muriel's daughter. You can't treat her like that. It's going to start a war, I can feel it. She'll retaliate, and I'm not sure you're ready for that." I leaned back in my chair, letting the words wash over me. My mother had always been cautious about Muriel's temper, and I understood why. Muriel was the type to plan her revenge carefully, to humiliate rather than confront. But I had already accepted that the risk was part of the satisfaction. "Mom, I know what I'm doing," I said firmly. "She's going to learn something about the real world. And honestly, it's about time someone showed Muriel that she doesn't control everything." She didn't reply for a moment. Finally, she said, "Just be careful, and don't let Ezra's frustration hurt you. She's not going to take this lightly." I smiled to myself. I wasn't worried about Ezra. It was Muriel I needed to watch. And I had a feeling the next family gathering would be interesting. Sure enough, by the time Saturday rolled around, the energy in the room was thick. Muriel had already arrived early, moving through the house with the precision of someone who planned everything down to the fork placement. I could feel her eyes on me the moment I stepped through the door, calculating, plotting. Ezra followed behind, dressed less sharply than usual, a subtle look of irritation etched on her face. It was clear the first week at the cafe had already humbled her slightly. Not humiliated yet, but she was learning, and I could see the flicker of self-awareness creeping in. Dinner started, and Muriel wasted no time. She sidled up to me, voice dripping with that familiar mix of superiority and irritation. "So, I hear Ezra has been learning at your cafe this week," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I can't imagine how that must have gone. Surely you're not expecting her to actually do real work." I kept my smile neutral, calm, measured. "She's learning a lot. You'd be surprised how quickly someone can adapt when they see the effort it takes to run a business. It's a useful lesson, I think." Muriel's jaw tightened. "A useful lesson? Benjamin, she's my daughter. You can't. This is ridiculous. She has the advantages. She's not meant to." I cut her off, my tone still calm, almost gentle. "Aunt Muriel, everyone has to learn. And honestly, I think she's lucky I offered her this. Some lessons are harder when you refuse to see the world outside your comfort zone." The room grew quiet again. Ezra avoided my gaze, but I could feel her tension. My other cousins glanced nervously at each other, unsure of whether to intervene or stay silent. And then it happened. Muriel leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low hiss. "Benjamin, you have no idea what you've started. This isn't just about Ezra. You're challenging me. You've made me a fool in front of everyone. And fools aren't tolerated in my family." Her words were heavy, deliberate, almost theatrical. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just a minor scuffle over pride, it was war. She was ready to escalate, and whatever she had planned was going to be calculated and relentless. I leaned back, keeping my expression calm, but inside I was already thinking ahead. Muriel didn't know it yet, but I had been quietly preparing my own moves for years. The cafe was just the beginning. The long game, the real leverage, was still to come. And as she glared at me across the table, I felt the familiar thrill of knowing that the tables had not just turned, they had flipped completely. The night ended tensely, with Muriel whispering sharply to Ezra as we left the table. Ezra shot me a glance that was equal parts fear and defiance. I couldn't help but smile internally. She was learning, slowly but surely. After that dinner, I knew I had to prepare for Muriel's next move. She had always been meticulous when it came to undermining anyone who threatened her image, and experience had taught me that when she felt challenged, she would escalate quietly but decisively. My plan wasn't just to react. I wanted to be several steps ahead. I spent the next few weeks quietly observing both Muriel and Ezra, keeping my cafe running smoothly while letting them squirm in their own ways. Ezra's first days had been awkward. She wasn't used to manual labor or dealing directly with customers. One morning, I watched as she fumbled with a large stack of pastries, nearly dropping them in front of an impatient line. Her face went red, and I couldn't hide a small, satisfied smile. Not because I wanted her to fail, but because I knew she was finally experiencing the world beyond constant praise and handouts. Muriel, meanwhile, had taken to subtle sabotage. During our brief text exchanges, she would accidentally remind Ezra of family expectations or criticize minor details about the cafe's menu. She also began calling my other relatives, planting little seeds of doubt. Benjamin doesn't know what he's doing. He's putting Ezra in positions she doesn't deserve. I let it happen. The more she tried to manipulate the narrative, the more evidence I collected for my ultimate move. Then came the opportunity one had been waiting for. One Saturday, I invited Muriel and the extended family to the cafe under the guise of a casual brunch. I knew she couldn't resist showing off Ezra, and of course, she wouldn't miss a chance to gloat about her family's supposed superiority. I spent the morning arranging the tables, making sure every display looked perfect, every detail meticulous. I wanted this to be flawless. When they arrived, Muriel's face was unreadable at first, her usual mask of control, carefully constructed. Ezra trailed behind her, less polished than usual, her discomfort evident. As they were seated, I greeted them warmly. "Welcome, Muriel, Ezra. I hope you're ready to see the cafe in action." Muriel smiled tightly, her eyes flicking around the room as if inspecting every corner. "Benjamin, I'm sure it's lovely. But this isn't really work, is it? Surely Ezra will just be helping casually." I shook my head. I promised her a proper experience. She's been here for 3 weeks now, learning everything from inventory to customer service. Today, she'll be in charge of a few key tasks while I supervise. I think she's ready. Muriel stiffened, and I could see the panic behind her eyes. She had imagined this being embarrassing for me, not her daughter having to face the reality of actual work. I handed Ezra a clipboard and a pen. "Here's your schedule for the next hour. You'll handle these tables, take orders, and coordinate with the kitchen." Her jaw dropped. "Me? I can't." "You can," I said gently. "I'll be right here if you need help. But I think you're capable." Muriel's face turned crimson, and she muttered something under her breath that I didn't catch. I took a moment to survey the cafe. Every other customer was watching silently, intrigued by the tension between Muriel, Ezra, and me. I could almost hear the whispers forming in the background. This is family drama playing out in public. And it was exactly that. Ezra struggled at first, taking orders slowly, dropping a few napkins, miscalculating table numbers. Muriel's attempts to intervene only made things worse. I stayed calm, occasionally giving Ezra gentle guidance, letting her gain confidence while Muriel floundered, unable to step in without looking controlling in front of everyone. After about 20 minutes, something remarkable happened. Ezra started to find her rhythm. She was still cautious, but she moved confidently between tables, recorded orders accurately, and even managed a tricky customer without flinching. I watched Muriel's expression shift from disbelief to outright panic. She realized she was losing control, not only over her daughter, but over the narrative she had tried to dominate for years. At that moment, I knew it was time to escalate further. I had spent weeks preparing, quietly ensuring that everything would go perfectly for my final reveal. I had contacted a local food blogger, a critic who specialized in small businesses, and invited them to the cafe under the guise of an anonymous tasting event. The plan was simple. The blogger would arrive mid-service and experience the cafe exactly as it operated, with Ezra fully participating. I wanted it all recorded: Muriel's reactions, Ezra's performance, and my own calm composure. The blogger arrived, clipboard and camera in hand. They sampled pastries, chatted with customers, and observed the interactions at the tables. I continued to supervise Ezra discreetly, allowing her to shine while Muriel's frustration grew. Finally, after the tasting, I stood at the center of the cafe. "Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'd like to announce something. The cafe has officially hired Ezra as part of the team. She'll be receiving a stipend for her work and will continue training here. She's been doing exceptionally well, and I'm proud of her progress." The silence that followed was deafening. Muriel's fork clattered onto a plate somewhere in the background, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Ezra, pale but determined, Looked like she had just stepped into a new reality. What, you can't? She's my daughter. Muriel's voice rose slightly, panic turning to fury. This isn't, she doesn't need, this isn't right. I smiled, calm and collected. Aunt Muriel, she's learning real skills. That's all. And I think she's capable of much more than either of us imagined. The bloggers snapped photos, jotting notes in their clipboard. Every eye in the cafe was on Muriel, silently judging, watching her unravel in a way that only years of condescension could come back to haunt you. I had expected Muriel to storm out, but she surprised me. She sat frozen, silent for several long moments, then leaned toward Ezra and whispered something I couldn't hear. I could tell, though, by the tightness in Ezra's shoulders, that it wasn't comforting. The rest of the family exchanged quiet glances, none daring to speak. I realized in that moment that the first public crack in Muriel's armor had appeared. She had always believed that everyone would side with her, that she was untouchable. But now, in a crowded cafe, with a critic watching and my quiet calm dominating the room, her power was slipping away. After that brunch, Muriel's attempts to reclaim control became obvious, almost comical in their desperation. She tried sending Ezra subtle suggestions via texts, hoping to guilt her into quitting. She started posting passive-aggressive comments on social media, tagging relatives in posts that implied I was taking advantage of her daughter. Even some of my cousins, who had once snickered at me behind my back, started questioning my motives, clearly influenced by her whispers. I stayed calm through all of it. Every message, every sneer, every calculated accidental insult she tried to throw my way was meticulously documented. I knew this would be my advantage when it came time to show the family the full picture. 2 weeks later, I invited the entire extended family to a grand reopening at the cafe, a public event meant to showcase the business's growth and, of course, Ezra's progress. This time, I made sure everything was covered. A local food critic had agreed to come, a small photography team was scheduled to take pictures, and I had arranged a short presentation about the cafe's journey, highlighting every team member, including Ezra. Muriel arrived early, of course. She wore her usual carefully curated outfit and carried an air of superiority, as if showing up would somehow restore her dominance. Ezra followed, quiet and tense. The event began. I greeted the family warmly, then took a few moments to introduce the staff. When I came to Ezra, I gestured toward her with genuine pride. Ezra has been learning with us for the past month, and I'm happy to announce she's officially part of the team. She's done incredibly well, managing everything from customer service to inventory, and she's even started helping me plan some new menu items. Muriel's face went red almost instantly. She opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised a hand lightly. Aunt Muriel, I know you might feel protective, but I promise you, she's thriving. And it's been a pleasure to see her grow into a role she once couldn't imagine herself in. The critic stepped forward, taking notes and snapping photos. I've been visiting many cafes in town, but this is remarkable. The staff works seamlessly, and the attention to detail is impressive. Ezra, I must say, your management skills are excellent for someone so new. Muriel's composure collapsed in front of everyone. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her handbag. Benjamin, she's my daughter, she stammered. You can't. I remained calm, almost casual. I think it's important to let her succeed on her own merits. She's worked hard. That's all there is to it. Ezra looked at her mother and, for the first time, spoke clearly, no hesitation in her voice. I'm not leaving. I've learned more here in a few weeks than I ever did at home. I want to stay. Muriel's face fell completely, a mix of fury, shame, and disbelief. She had spent years trying to control both Ezra and the rest of the family, and now her daughter was choosing independence and hard-earned respect over her mother's manipulation. By the end of the event, the entire family, including the cousins who had once mocked me, were impressed, some openly congratulating me on the cafe and Ezra's progress. Muriel tried to leave quietly, but I made sure she was part of a brief toast, where I subtly highlighted the cafe's growth, the team's dedication, and the importance of genuine effort over entitlement. Every word landed like a quiet hammer, not an insult, but a clear statement. Her control was gone. Afterward, I didn't hear from Muriel for weeks. She had retreated into her shell, furious and humiliated, while Ezra continued to work at the cafe, increasingly confident and competent. My other relatives, realizing the family hierarchy had shifted, began treating me with more respect, or at least caution. In the end, I had taken a long-standing pattern of family judgment and turned it completely around. Muriel's pride was shattered publicly. Ezra learned the value of hard work, and my small business thrived. The family's attempts to belittle me no longer held power because the narrative had changed. I wasn't just running a cafe anymore. I was the one who held the leverage in family dynamics, and the people who had once looked down on me were forced to recognize it. Muriel remained a villain in the story, clinging to the belief that she could manipulate anyone, but the truth was clear to everyone. Her influence was broken, and the control she had wielded for decades was gone. As for me, I continued to run the cafe, expand the team, and quietly enjoy the satisfaction of watching the family adjust to a new reality, one where effort and merit mattered far more than entitlement and favoritism. In the end, the revenge wasn't loud or confrontational. It was complete, quiet, and undeniable. Muriel's own behavior had created the perfect scenario for her downfall, and I had simply orchestrated the stage for it to unfold. And that, Reddit, is how I finally turned years of being mocked and overlooked into a victory that the entire family, and especially Muriel, couldn't ignore. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.